I was 29 when I took the job. It wasn't anything special, just temporary work at a logging site deep in the mountains of northern Montana. A buddy of mine had done a season there the year before, and he told me it was good money if I didn't mind isolation and long hours. I'd been drifting between jobs, so I figured why not. The company put us up in cabins spread out along the tree line, about a mile from the main logging camp. There were about 20 of us, but the cabins were spaced apart to keep things quiet. Most of the guys shared, but I got lucky and had mine to myself. It was a simple place, wooden walls, a cot, a small table, and a stove for heat. No running water. We used a communal shower and restroom near the main camp. It wasn't bad, just lonely. But I liked lonely. We worked long hours, 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, cutting down trees and hauling logs. The cold bit at my hands in the mornings, even through my gloves. The air smelled of pine and sap, mixed with the diesel from our equipment. Most nights, I was too tired to do anything but eat and sleep. The isolation didn't bother me at first, but then little things started happening. It was the second week when I noticed something was off. At first, it was just small stuff. My boots weren't where I left them, my tools had been moved. I chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe just forgetting. But then I started feeling like I was being watched. When I walked back to my cabin at night, I'd get this creeping sensation, like someone was just behind me. The trees pressed in from both sides of the trail, their trunks black against the sky. I'd look back, but there was nothing, just the wind through the pines, the crunch of snow under my boots. One night, I woke up to a noise outside, a shuffling sound, like something heavy moving just beyond the walls. I lay still, holding my breath. My rifle was leaning against the wall near my cot, but I didn't move to grab it. The sound stopped. I waited, staring at the ceiling, listening. Minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my cabin. I sat up. The only light came from the embers in the stove, casting an orange glow against the walls. I reached for my rifle, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped near the window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then 3 knocks. Soft, careful. I stayed frozen. I didn't answer. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I heard the crunch of footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself it was probably one of the guys messing with me, maybe a prank. But no one said anything at work, and when I asked around, nobody admitted to it. That day, I noticed something else. Tracks in the snow. They led from the tree line to my cabin, circled around it, then back into the woods. They were human, bare feet. No shoes, no boots. The skin must have been frozen solid. I stared at them for a long time before covering them up with fresh snow. I didn't want to think about it. The next few nights were quiet, but the feeling never went away. The sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck standing up when I walked back from camp. Then it happened again. This time, I woke up to my door creaking open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I grabbed my rifle and sat up, aiming at the dark rectangle of the doorway. The cold air rushed in, but I couldn't see anything beyond the threshold. Just the trees and snow, the wind shifting through the branches. I stood slowly, stepping toward the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I saw them, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, thin, not moving. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark shape against the snow. I raised the rifle. My hands shook. It didn't move, just stood there. I don't know how long I aimed before I finally backed inside and slammed the door. I locked it, shoved my cot against it, then sat with my back to the wall, gripping the rifle until my fingers ached. I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, the figure was gone, but there were prints in the snow again. bare feet leading to my door, standing there, then walking away. I went straight to the foreman that morning, told him someone was messing around the cabins at night. He listened, nodding slowly, then sighed. "You're not the first," he said. He told me that over the years, other workers had seen things. Strange figures in the woods, things moving at night, but they never found anyone, never caught anyone. "Probably some hermit," he said. "Some guy living out there watching us. Happens more than you think." That didn't make me feel any better. That night, I stayed up with the rifle. I didn't turn out the light. I kept the stove burning, listening for any sound outside. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of breathing, right outside the window. Slow, deep. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then came the knock. Soft, careful, just like before. I didn't answer. I never answered. Eventually, the breathing faded. The snow crunched. The thing, whatever it was, walked away. When morning came, I packed my things. I told the foreman I was done. I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about the job. I left that same day, driving down the long, empty road, away from the mountains, away from the trees. I never went back, and I never stopped thinking about those footprints in the snow. I hadn't been to the old family cabin in years. It was tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, miles away from anything, just a small wooden place my grandfather had built with his own hands. He used it for hunting and fishing back in the day. Then my father took over, and now it was mine. I had been putting off visiting for a long time, mostly because life got in the way. Work, relationships, the usual excuses. But this year, I made the time. I needed a break, something to clear my head. A week alone in the woods, away from everything, seemed like the perfect reset. I packed up my truck with supplies, canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, and my old hunting rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but it felt wrong to go out there without it. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours, and the roads got rougher the further I went. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place looked exactly as I remembered, small, weathered, with a sagging porch and a stone chimney. The paint had peeled off in places, but it was still standing strong. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and dampness hanging in the air. I set my bags down, opened a few windows to let in fresh air, and started checking around. The cabin had one main room with a wood stove in the corner, a simple kitchen, and a small bedroom in the back. It was basic, but it had everything I needed. I spent the first night getting settled, chopping some firewood, making a simple meal, and sitting on the porch with a beer. The woods around me were quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. I hadn't felt this relaxed in a long time, but that changed the next day. It started with small things. I woke up to find the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it the night before, but maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I brushed it off, closed it, and went about my morning. I made coffee, stepped outside to breathe in the crisp air, and decided to take a walk. There was an old trail that led deeper into the woods, one my grandfather used to take when he went hunting. I figured I'd follow it for a bit, get a feel for the land again. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. The trees were marked, long, deep scratches running down the bark. Not claw marks, but something made with a blade. A knife, maybe. The cuts were fresh, the wood underneath still pale and raw. I ran my fingers over one of them, feeling the rough edges. Someone had been here recently. The thought put me on edge. The cabin was remote, and as far as I knew, no one had been out this way for years. The land technically belonged to me, but it wasn't like I had a fence or posted signs to keep people out. Still, it felt wrong. I turned back, walking faster than before. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something else. My axe was missing. I had left it outside the night before, stuck in the chopping block. Now it was gone. I searched around, checked the porch, even looked in the trees nearby. Nothing. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were large, deep in the dirt, leading from the tree line to the cabin and back. I crouched down, looking closer. They were fresh. Someone had been here while I was gone. I felt my stomach tighten. I went inside, locked the door, and grabbed my rifle. I wasn't panicking. Maybe it was a hiker, someone lost, passing through, but something about it felt off. I stayed inside for a while, listening, waiting. The woods were silent. That night, I barely slept. I kept the rifle close, my ears tuned to every sound outside. Around midnight, I heard something moving in the trees. Slow, deliberate steps, twigs snapping underfoot. I held my breath, heart pounding. Then the footsteps stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. After a long time, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the morning light streaming through the window. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but when I walked to the tree line, I found something that made my blood run cold. The axe was stuck in a tree. Not just stuck, wedged deep into the wood, as if someone had swung it with all their strength. The handle was at an angle, the blade buried. Someone had done this on purpose. I yanked it out, gripping the handle tight. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I went back inside, packed my things, and loaded up the truck. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the distance. A man, standing just beyond the trees. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. His face was shadowed by the branches, but I could see that he was watching me. I didn't move, neither did he. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't wait to see where he went. I got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. Fast. The whole way back, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing on the side of the road. But I never did. I didn't stop until I was back home, locking the doors behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe it was just some drifter, someone living off the land. But something about it didn't feel right. I still think about it sometimes, especially at night when the house is quiet. The way he stood there, the way he watched, and the way he made sure I knew he was there. I had no reason to drive past that road anymore. Not for years. But life has a way of forcing you to face things you thought you'd left behind. It was late October, cold and damp. The kind of weather that chills you all the way through, no matter how many layers you wear. I was heading back from a job out west, a long haul that had taken more out of me than I expected. My mind was tired, my body even more so, and I just wanted to be home. But when I checked my GPS, I saw the usual route was jammed up with traffic, some accident clogging the highway for miles. I didn't think much of it at first. I just tapped on an alternate route without looking too hard. I wanted to get moving, get back on the road. It wasn't until I was about 20 miles in that I realized where I was heading. That road, that damn road. It had been over 6 years since I had last been there, since I had last seen that cabin. I hadn't thought about it in a long time, at least not actively, but my stomach tightened the second I realized where my tires were taking me. I almost turned around. Almost. But it was late and I was exhausted. The detour was already set. I told myself I'd just pass through, not even glance at the place. Just another stretch of road. Nothing more. The trees thickened as I drove on, the pavement turning rougher. This was an old road, barely maintained, only used by the few stubborn folks still living up in the woods. It was isolated, quiet, the kind of quiet that made your own breathing sound too loud. I knew exactly where the cabin would be, just around a bend past a small bridge, tucked back behind a clearing. I could already picture it in my head. The dark wood, the sagging porch, the broken window that never got fixed. I tightened my grip on the wheel. The rain had started again. Light at first, just a mist against the windshield. Then harder, the wipers working in a steady rhythm. I focused on the road, on the glow of my headlights cutting through the dark. But I could feel it coming. That moment when I'd have to pass it. And then there it was. First, it looked the same. That same hunched over look, like the weight of time had been pressing down on it. The driveway was overgrown, weeds climbing over the gravel. The porch sagged even more now, the roof dark with rot. But something was different. The door was open, not wide, just a crack. A sliver of darkness barely visible through the rain. I told myself it was the wind, the weather. Maybe some animal had nosed its way inside, looking for shelter. But I knew that wasn't true. That door had been locked when we left it. The kind of old, heavy lock that didn't just fall apart. I slowed down. I didn't want to, but my foot eased off the gas before I could stop it. My headlights swept across the cabin, lighting it up for just a second. And in that second, I saw something else. Footprints. Not old ones. Fresh. Leading up to the door, disappearing inside. I don't know why I stopped. Any sane person would have kept driving. But something in me, curiosity, stupidity, whatever you want to call it, made me pull over. The second I did, I regretted it. The rain hammered down as I stepped out, soaking through my jacket instantly. The cold bit into my skin, my breath fogging up in the air. I could barely see through the darkness, but I could feel it. That heaviness, that wrongness. I took a step forward, then another. The footprints were deep, pressed into the mud. A man's, maybe, big, but there was something off about them. The spacing was strange, uneven, like whoever made them wasn't walking normally. I stopped at the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. The door was still open, just barely. I could hear the wind creaking through the old beams, the rain dripping somewhere inside. The air smelled damp, stale, like something had been sitting there for too long. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe some drifter, someone squatting in an abandoned place. Maybe just emptiness. But when I pushed the door open, my stomach dropped. It wasn't empty. Someone had been living there. The inside was a mess. Not just old and broken down, but disturbed. The furniture had been moved, the dust wiped away in places. A sleeping bag was rolled out in the middle of the floor, dirty and damp. Empty food cans were scattered around, some rusted, some still fresh. Whoever they were, they hadn't been gone long. The worst part was the smell. Not just mildew, but something sour, something rotten. It clung to the walls, to the floor, to the air itself. I should have left right then. Turned around, walked back out, driven away without looking back. But then I saw it. The pictures. They were laid out on the table, neat, careful. Pictures of me. Not old ones. Recent. Me at work. Me at the store. Me getting into my truck. Someone had been watching me, following me. My heart pounded. My skin went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. I backed up, slow, careful. I didn't turn my back. My gut told me not to. Then I heard it. A rustling. From the back room. Someone was still here. I didn't think. I ran. I hit the porch hard, nearly slipping on the wet wood. My tires kicked up mud as I threw myself into the truck. My hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. The engine roared to life, the headlights slicing through the dark. And that's when I saw him, just for a second. A figure standing in the doorway, tall, still, watching. I didn't stay to get a better look. I floored it, the truck fishtailing on the wet road before catching traction. I drove faster than I should have, my knuckles white on the wheel. I didn't slow down, not until I was miles away, until the trees thinned out and the lights of a gas station came into view. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, my breath coming too fast. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been following me, but I knew one thing for sure. That wasn't the last time I'd see him, and next time I might not be lucky enough to get away. I had never been a fan of cabins. There was something unsettling about being alone in the woods, miles away from the next person, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the way the darkness felt heavier in places like that. But when my dad's friend, a man named Tom, invited me to spend a weekend at his cabin, I figured I might as well go. Tom had owned the place for years. He used it mostly for hunting trips or just to get away from the noise of the city. My dad had been up there with him plenty of times and always said it was peaceful. Good place to clear your head, he told me. Tom's got everything set up, solar power, a water pump, propane stove. It's not roughing it too bad. I had no reason to say no. I wasn't doing much that weekend, and a break from everything sounded nice. So, I packed my bag, filled up my truck, and drove out to the middle of nowhere. Tom had given me directions. It was about a 4-hour drive out of town, through a long stretch of highway, then down a winding dirt road that cut deep into the forest. He told me the nearest store was about 20 miles away, so I made sure to bring plenty of food and water. By the time I got there, the sun was already setting. The cabin was just how I imagined it. Small, sturdy, made of dark wood, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick pines that stretched in every direction. There was an old fire pit out front, a stack of chopped wood by the door, and an old rusted pickup parked off to the side, which I assumed was Tom's. Tom wasn't there when I arrived. He had told me he might be out hunting when I got in, so I let myself in. The inside was just as rustic as I expected. Wood paneling, a simple kitchen, a few mismatched chairs, and a couch that had seen better days. There were animal heads mounted on the walls, a rifle rack near the door, and a heavy iron stove in the corner. I set my bag down in the small bedroom and stepped outside to get some air. The woods were quiet, the kind of silence you only find in places like that. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, just the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful, but at the same time it felt off. I shook the feeling off, chalking it up to just being alone in an unfamiliar place. I made myself something to eat, sat out on the porch for a while, and then decided to call it a night. That's when things started to feel wrong. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a sound outside, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps on the dry leaves. At first, I thought it might just be an animal. The woods were full of deer, raccoons, and other things that could make noise at night. But the sound was steady, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just beyond the tree line. I sat up, my heart suddenly pounding. I listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and moved to the window. I shined the light out, sweeping it across the trees. Nothing, just the thick wall of pines and the endless dark beyond. I told myself it was just my imagination. That's the thing about being out in the woods. You start hearing things, seeing things that aren't really there. But just as I was about to turn away, something moved, a shadow just at the edge of the trees. I froze, staring hard at the spot where I thought I saw it. But there was nothing there now, just darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the window. I felt stupid. It was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a deer moving through the brush. I decided to ignore it and went back to bed. But the feeling didn't go away. The next morning, I woke up to find something strange. Out by the fire pit, the stack of firewood had been disturbed. Some of the logs had been moved, not in a random way, but almost like someone had deliberately arranged them. I felt a chill run through me. I tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe an animal had knocked them over. Maybe I just hadn't paid close enough attention to how they were stacked when I arrived. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the day trying to shake the feeling. I went for a walk, tried to enjoy the quiet, but the unease never left me. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there. That night, it happened again. I had just settled in bed when I heard it, those same footsteps. This time, they were closer. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. The sound stopped immediately. I got up, moved to the window and shined the light outside. And that's when I saw it. A man, standing just at the edge of the trees. He wasn't moving. He wasn't saying anything. Just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. I felt a cold wave of fear rush through me. I stepped back from the window, turned off the flashlight, and moved as quietly as I could to the rifle rack by the door. I grabbed one of Tom's rifles, though I wasn't sure if it was loaded. I stood there in the dark, listening. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were retreating, fading into the distance. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the rifle, my ears straining for any sound. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside, half expecting to find footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but another part of me refused to be scared away. I told myself it could have been a hunter or maybe even Tom. Maybe he had come back late and didn't want to wake me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I made it through the day, but that night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, gripping the rifle, when I heard it. Not footsteps this time, something else. Breathing, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The sound was low, steady, like someone standing just on the other side of the glass. I stayed frozen, heart hammering, praying that whoever or whatever it was would just go away. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it did. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I didn't care if it was all in my head. I wasn't staying another night. I never told Tom what happened. I never told my dad either. I don't know who or what was out there, but I never went back to that cabin again. And I never will. I didn't inherit the farm cabin outright. It wasn't some old family property passed down through generations, and it wasn't left to me in a will. I ended up with it through circumstances that, at the time, seemed practical. My uncle had lived there for years, tending to the land, keeping the place running. When his health declined, he moved into a care home, and the cabin was left empty. It wasn't a grand place, just a single-story wooden cabin, set in the middle of a stretch of farmland that had once been productive, but had long since been neglected. The land had overgrown, the fences had started to lean and break, and the soil had turned hard. No one else in the family wanted it. It was too far from town, too much work, too isolated. But I took it. At the time, I figured I could fix it up. Maybe sell it later, or maybe live there long-term if I liked it. I'd been living in the city, in a small apartment, and I was ready for a change. Something quiet. Something where I didn't have to deal with people every day. The cabin itself wasn't in bad shape, at least not structurally. The roof held up, the walls were solid, and it had electricity and plumbing, though both were old and in need of maintenance. The inside was a different story. Dust everywhere, spider webs in the corners, and a smell of old wood and stale air. The first few weeks were spent cleaning. I threw out old furniture that had rotted, swept out years of dirt, and patched up small holes in the walls. The land was another issue altogether. Weeds had taken over the fields, and the barn, which was a good 100 yards from the cabin, had a collapsed section in the roof. At first, I didn't mind the work. Kept me busy, and at night, when I sat outside with a beer, I enjoyed the quiet. There were no city noises, no distant car horns or sirens, just the sounds of insects, the wind in the trees, and sometimes the faint howl of a coyote. But there were also things that didn't sit right with me. Started small. At night, I'd hear sounds coming from the barn. Not the usual creaks of an old building settling, but things moving. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Other times, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. The first time I checked, I found nothing, just the barn in its state of disrepair. The second time, I took a flashlight and a rifle with me, just in case it was an animal. The barn smelled of mold and rot, and the floor was littered with old tools and farming equipment. But nothing was inside. After that, I tried to ignore the sounds. It wasn't until I started noticing things around the cabin itself that I became uneasy. One morning, I woke up to find the back door slightly open. I knew I had locked it the night before. The lock wasn't broken, just undone, like someone had turned it from the inside. Another time, I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine. Too large and deep, like someone heavier had been walking there. They led around the side of the house and stopped near a window. I told myself it was paranoia. Living out there alone in an unfamiliar place, it was easy to get jumpy. Maybe animals had nudged the door open. Maybe the footprints were from a passing hunter. Then I found the knife. It was in the barn, lying on the dirt floor near the entrance. A large hunting knife, old and rusted, but still sharp. I didn't own a knife like that. It hadn't been there before. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking them before I went to bed. I kept the rifle beside me, something I had never done before. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made me sit up and listen. The wind against the walls, the creak of wood. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Slow, steady footsteps on the porch. Not a raccoon or some small animal. Something heavy, human. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped near the door. Then the knob turned. It didn't rattle or shake, just a slow, deliberate turn. Testing. I gripped the rifle tighter, my mind racing. Should I call someone? There was no cell service out here. If I fired a shot, would anyone even hear it? The knob stopped turning. Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slow and steady, like whoever it was knew I was listening. They didn't run. They didn't panic. I stayed awake until dawn, rifle in hand, every muscle tense. When the sun came up, I went outside, my hands still shaking. There were fresh footprints leading from the porch, heading toward the barn. I didn't follow them. I packed up a bag, took the rifle, and drove into town. I wasn't leaving for good, not yet, but I needed to clear my head. I got a motel room for the night, slept with the lights on, and tried to convince myself I had imagined most of it. The next day, I bought new locks, a heavier door, even a camera, though I wasn't sure how well it would work with the weak power supply. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was the footprints. They were fresh, leading from the barn to the house. Someone had been back while I was gone. Inside, nothing was taken, but the knife was gone. I installed the locks, set up the camera, and made sure everything was secure. That night, I sat in the dark, watching the monitor, the rifle beside me. At 2 a.m., the motion sensor went off. The screen showed a figure standing in the yard, just at the edge of the light. Tall, broad, standing completely still. Watching. I didn't move. I didn't go outside. I just sat there, heart pounding, watching the screen. After a few minutes, the figure turned and walked toward the barn. The next morning, I checked the barn. The door was open, but nothing was inside. No footprints, no sign of anything. Just the old tools and dust. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some drifter, maybe someone who had lived on the land before and didn't want to let it go. Maybe something worse. I left the cabin a week later, packed everything up and never looked back. Whoever it was, they could have it. I never should have gone back to that cabin. I was 36 when it happened. It was the winter of 2017, and I had been working as a construction manager for the past decade. My uncle had passed away a few months earlier, and he left me a cabin out in the middle of nowhere in northern Michigan. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager, but I remembered the place well. Thick trees all around, a long dirt road leading up to it, and no neighbors for miles. It wasn't exactly a luxurious place. The cabin was old, built in the 60s, with a slanted roof and a porch that was falling apart. It had no cell reception, no internet, and the only source of heat was an old wood stove. My uncle had been a hunter, so the place was filled with deer heads on the walls and old hunting gear collecting dust. I had no plans of keeping it. I wanted to sell it, but I had to check it out first, make sure it wasn't falling apart completely. That was the only reason I went there. I told myself I'd spend one night, clean up what I could, and get the paperwork started. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had taken longer than expected because of the snow. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely passable, and I almost got stuck a couple of times. When I finally pulled up, I sat in my truck for a minute, staring at the place. It looked smaller than I remembered, more worn down. The windows were dirty, and the porch sagged worse than I thought. The trees around the cabin were thick and dark. They stretched high into the sky, blocking out most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the day, it felt isolated. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional sound of the wind moving through the trees. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching in the snow. The air was sharp and cold. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and made my way up the steps. The front door was stiff, but after a few hard pushes, it finally gave way, letting out a long, slow creak. Inside, the air was stale. Dust covered everything. The wooden floors creaked under my weight, and the place smelled like old wood and mildew. There was an old recliner in the corner, a fireplace filled with ash, and a small wooden table with a hunting knife stuck into it. I set my bag down and went to check the back door. It was still locked. The windows were all intact. That was a relief. At least I wouldn't have to deal with any break-ins or squatters. I started cleaning up, dusting off shelves, throwing away old newspapers and empty cans. As I worked, the feeling of being watched crept over me. It made no sense, but I couldn't shake it. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The place was old and empty. There was no one out here. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove. I made a quick meal of canned chili and sat at the table, staring at the old hunting knife still stuck in the wood. My uncle had always been paranoid. He never went anywhere without a knife or a gun. I figured he left it there out of habit. After eating, I checked my phone. No signal. That was expected, but it still made me uneasy. I decided to turn in early. I set up my sleeping bag on the old couch and shut off the lantern. The only light came from the glow of the fire. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear the trees creaking in the distance. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound, a sharp crunch. My eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Another crunch. It came from outside. I held my breath, listening. The wind howled through the trees, but beneath it, I could hear something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the snow. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I stayed still for what felt like forever, straining my ears. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it, I heard the creak of the front porch. I reached for the hunting knife on the table, gripping it tight. Then nothing. No more footsteps. No more movement. Just the wind. I waited for what felt like an eternity before finally getting up. I moved carefully, my socks silent against the wooden floor. I reached the window and peeked out. Nothing. Just the trees and the snow. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wind knocked something over. I told myself anything to keep calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound made my skin crawl. Morning finally came, and I forced myself to step outside. My breath came out in thick clouds as I looked around. That's when I saw them. Footprints, deep in the snow, leading from the tree line to my porch. My stomach turned. They weren't mine. Someone had been out here. Someone had been watching me. I packed up my things in record time. I didn't care about cleaning anymore. I needed to get out of there. I locked the cabin and made my way to the truck. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine roared to life, I nearly cried in relief. I backed out fast, my tires skidding slightly in the snow. As I pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I pressed the gas harder, not looking back. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it as fast as I could, never telling the buyer what had happened. I still don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think about those footprints in the snow, and I wonder how close he got before I woke up. I don't know why I remember that night so clearly. Maybe it's because I still can't make sense of it. Maybe it's because, no matter how much time has passed, I still see her when I close my eyes. It happened in the autumn of 2017. I had taken a short trip to the Lake District in England, hoping to clear my mind for a few days. I was 32 at the time, working long hours at a job that drained me. My boss had given me a rare week off, and I wanted to spend it somewhere quiet. No phones, no emails, just the sound of the wind and the trees. I had found a remote cabin online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place tucked away deep in the woods. It was cheap, secluded, and had everything I needed. A bed, a fireplace, a small kitchenette. Enough to get by. The nearest village was about a 40-minute drive away, and I had stocked up on supplies before heading there. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it hiking, enjoying the cold air, the smell of damp leaves, the distant sound of birds. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I made myself a simple meal, read for a while by the fire, and then went to bed early. But the second night was different. It had been raining all afternoon, and by the time darkness settled in, the wind had picked up. The cabin creaked and groaned as the storm rattled the walls. I wasn't scared, just uneasy. The kind of feeling you get when you're in a place that doesn't quite feel like yours. I decided to go outside for some air. I don't know why. I guess I thought stepping out might help shake the unease. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a figure standing near the tree-line, maybe 30 feet away. A woman. She was barely visible in the dark, but the flashlight caught just enough. Her thin frame, the pale color of her dress. She was completely still. I froze. The rain was coming down hard, the wind making the trees sway violently. But she didn't move. She didn't react to the cold, didn't seem to care that she was getting soaked. She just stood there, watching. I don't know how long I stood there staring at her. A few seconds? A full minute? My brain struggled to make sense of it. There were no other cabins nearby. No houses, no roads, no reason for anyone to be out here in the middle of a storm. I took a step forward, raising my flashlight slightly, but the moment the beam moved over her face, she turned and walked into the trees. Not hurriedly, not running, just walking. Slow, deliberate, like she knew exactly where she was going. I didn't follow. I should have gone inside right then, locked the door, maybe even packed my things and left. But I didn't. I stood there for a long time, staring at the trees, waiting to see if she would come back. She never did. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. The wind, the rain, the occasional creak of the trees. I kept picturing her standing there, her blank face, the way she had turned and disappeared without hesitation. Morning came and I felt stupid. Maybe she had been a lost hiker. Maybe a local taking a strange shortcut. I couldn't explain why she had been standing so still, why she hadn't reacted to the cold, but I told myself it didn't matter. Still, I spent the day keeping busy, hiking again, chopping wood for the fireplace, anything to push the image of her out of my head. That night, though, things got worse. I was inside, sitting by the fire, when I heard it, a soft, steady tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling something outside, but then I realized it was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, heart hammering. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, but I could see just enough. A hand, pale fingers tapping against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, the fingers curled away from the glass. The shape outside shifted. A figure moved past the window, disappearing into the darkness. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, and stood up. My legs felt unsteady, my breath shallow. I wanted to look outside, to check if she was still there, but every part of me screamed not to. Instead, I locked the door. Then I checked the windows, making sure every latch was secure. I stoked the fire, sat down with my back against the wall, and waited. The rest of the night was silent. No more tapping, no more movement, just the wind, the trees, and my own breathing. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my bag without caring if it was folded or neat. I loaded up the car and took one last look at the cabin. It looked normal, peaceful, even like nothing had happened. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, leading from the window to the tree-line. Deep, clear prints in the damp earth. Barefoot. I got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I booked a room at a small hotel. I didn't go back for the rest of my things. I didn't care. I never found out who she was. I didn't check the news, didn't ask around, didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget. But some nights, when it's quiet and dark, I still think about her, standing there in the rain, watching. I had been hunting in the mountains for years, but that winter, something felt different. It was late November, and the cold had settled in early. I had a small, old hunting cabin deep in the woods, about 15 miles from the nearest road. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table, but it was enough for a few days away from everything. I had made the trip alone dozens of times before, but that year, something about the silence of the woods unsettled me. The hike in was harder than usual. Snow had come early, and the weight of my pack dug into my shoulders as I moved through the trees. The forest was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet I was used to, but a dead silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. Normally, I'd hear birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch from a deer moving nearby. That day, there was nothing, just the sound of my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of old wood and cold air. Everything was as I had left it. My supplies were still on the shelves, and the cot was neatly folded against the wall. I set my pack down, lit a fire in the wood stove, and sat for a while, listening to the crackling of the flames. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and then stepped outside for a smoke. The sky was clear, and the stars were brighter than I had seen in months. But the silence remained. I stood there for a while, scanning the tree line, feeling as though something was just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching. I told myself it was nothing, just the stillness of winter, the way sound is swallowed up by the cold. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. A deer, or at least I thought it was. It stood too still, its legs locked in place, eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that didn't seem right. Its head was tilted, just slightly, like it was listening. I had seen deer freeze before, their ears twitching as they listened for danger, but this one never moved, not even the slight shifting of breath. I took a slow step forward, trying to get a better look. My boot crunched in the snow, and in that instant, the deer's head jerked toward me. Not a natural movement, too fast, too sharp, like it had been snapped into place. My stomach dropped. I took a step back toward the cabin, and it mirrored me, stepping forward. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound just outside the cabin. A slow, dragging sound. I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, leaving the room in shadows. The dragging noise stopped, replaced by the sound of someone, breathing just beyond the door. I reached for my rifle, keeping my movements slow, careful. The breathing continued, deep and rattling, like someone struggling to pull air through their throat. Then came the sound of a footstep on the porch. Not the light step of an animal. Heavier, human. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the rifle so hard my fingers ached. Then, a knock. Just one. A single, hollow sound against the wooden door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Another knock. Then silence. I stayed like that until dawn, every muscle in my body locked in place. When the first light of morning crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, I finally found the courage to move. I stood, rifle raised, and eased toward the door. I listened. Nothing. Slowly, I unlatched the door and pushed it open. The porch was empty. No footprints in the snow. Nothing to show that anyone or anything had been there at all. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was getting to me. But as I stepped off the porch, I saw something in the snow. A dead deer, its body twisted, neck at an unnatural angle. Its face, its mouth was wrong, too wide. Its lips peeled back, exposing yellow teeth that didn't belong to a deer. I didn't hunt that day. I didn't even leave the clearing. I spent the daylight hours chopping wood, trying to keep myself busy, trying not to look at the tree line where I swore I could feel something watching. That night, the noises started again. The slow, dragging footsteps circling the cabin. The breathing. The knock. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I had made my decision. I packed my things at first light and started the hike back. The silence followed me. Not just the natural quiet of the woods, but something heavier, something unnatural. It wasn't until I reached my truck that I let out a breath. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. Something stood at the tree line, watching. It wasn't a deer, and it wasn't a man. I never went back to that cabin. It was late October when I decided to head up to my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness. He hadn't used it in years, and it was in a remote area where few people went. I'd been hunting before, but never alone. The idea of spending a week out there, isolated, living off whatever I could hunt, seemed like the perfect break from my usual routine. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest paved road, sitting at the edge of a thick forest. My uncle used to tell stories about the place, how the land had been in our family for generations, how the woods held strange sounds at night. He never said anything outright creepy, but there was always something in his tone when he talked about it. He stopped going up there after an incident with a trespasser years back. He never explained what happened, just that he didn't feel comfortable there anymore. I packed up my truck with everything I thought I'd need. My rifle, extra rounds, a hatchet, a good knife, some canned food in case I wasn't successful in hunting, and plenty of firewood. I didn't expect cell service out there, so I brought a radio just in case. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the dirt trail. It took another hour of careful driving before I finally saw the cabin. It was just as I remembered, a small, one-room structure with a slanted metal roof, a porch with an old rocking chair, and a heavy wooden door. The place had been built solid, but time had worn it down. The paint on the walls had mostly peeled away, leaving the bare wood exposed to the elements. The windows were intact but covered in grime. A few feet away, a shed stood with rusted tools hanging on the walls. I unloaded my truck quickly, eager to get a fire going before the temperature dropped too much. The inside of the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was a simple cot in the corner, a small stove for cooking, and a few shelves with supplies left behind by my uncle. A hunting rifle still hung on the wall, the barrel spotted with rust. After getting settled, I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The woods stretched out in every direction, dark and silent. I stood there for a long time listening. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no distant calls from birds, nothing. Just the weight of the trees pressing in around me. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent most of my time tracking deer, setting up near a small clearing where I had spotted some tracks. I managed to take down a young buck on the second day, dragging it back to the cabin and cleaning it behind the shed. The work kept me busy, but as night fell, I started noticing little things. The silence wasn't normal. I had camped enough to know that forests are rarely quiet. There should have been owls, the occasional rustling of branches. But every night, as soon as the sun went down, everything stopped. Then there were the footprints. I found them on the third morning, just past the tree line near the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't from an animal.
Bare footprints. No shoes, no boots.
Just human feet pressing into the damp earth. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin, then disappeared. I told myself they must have been old. Maybe someone had wandered through months ago before the weather changed. But the ground had been damp from a light rain the night before. The prints were fresh. That night, I locked the cabin door. I wasn't scared yet, just cautious. I had my rifle within reach as I lay on the cot, listening. Hours passed, and I eventually drifted into sleep. Then something woke me. It was soft at first, barely a sound at all. A rustling. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying by. It was deliberate, slow. I held my breath, straining to hear. The porch creaked. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. The sound came again. A footstep, then another. Someone was on the porch. I forced myself to sit up, moving as quietly as I could. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting only faint light across the cabin. I stared at the door, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then the doorknob turned. I raised my rifle, ready to fire if it came to that. The knob rattled once, twice, then went still. The weight of the silence pressed down again. I sat there, unmoving, rifle aimed at the door, waiting. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I went outside to check. There were more footprints on the porch. Bare feet, leading from the woods, stopping right at the door. I had no idea how long they had stood there, just waiting. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself it was a hiker, maybe a lost camper. Someone passing through, curious about the cabin. I had my rifle. I had my knife. I could handle myself. The next day, I didn't hunt. I stayed close to the cabin, checking the perimeter, making sure nothing was missing. The woods felt different now. Every tree, every shadow seemed to hold something unseen. That night, I sat by the fire, listening. And then I heard it, a low, steady breathing. It wasn't inside. It was outside, just beyond the window. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The sound stayed for what felt like forever, slow and deep, just on the other side of the glass. Then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat up with my rifle in my hands, eyes fixed on the window. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't care about leaving anything behind. I just wanted to be gone. As I loaded my truck, I glanced toward the woods. There, just beyond the tree line, something stood. Person, thin, almost too thin, with skin that looked pale against the dark trees. They didn't move. They just watched. I got in the truck and drove. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, or why they never tried to break in. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle didn't ask why when I told him I was done with the place. Maybe he already knew. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just some lost hiker. And I never wanted to find out what it was. I should have never taken the job. I told myself that more times than I could count as I stood there, the rain pouring down in heavy sheets, soaking through my jacket. My boots were caked in thick mud. My gloves were damp and useless, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness around me. It wasn't supposed to be this bad. The job seemed easy enough when I agreed to it. A simple construction project, nothing too fancy, just a remote hunting cabin for some rich guy who wanted a private retreat deep in the woods. I was used to rough jobs, long hours, and hard labor, so when my boss asked if I could take a night shift to get ahead on the build, I didn't think twice. It was just another paycheck, another long night. I had no idea what I was walking into. The cabin site was miles from town, way out past the logging roads, in a stretch of forest that barely anyone used. The place felt untouched, like something that had been forgotten long ago. The dirt roads leading there were rough, barely passable in my truck, and with the rain turning them into slick, uneven trails, I nearly got stuck twice. By the time I reached the build site, the rain had been coming down for hours, turning the clearing into a mess of standing water and deep mud. The partially built cabin stood in the center, its skeletal frame exposed to the elements. The walls were up, but the roof was still unfinished, leaving the inside vulnerable to the storm. My job for the night was to work on reinforcing the walls and prepping materials for the next day's crew. Simple in theory. The first few hours went about as well as they could in that kind of weather. I worked under the light of a single flood lamp, hammering, cutting, securing planks where they needed to go. The rain made everything harder. Wood swelled with moisture. Nails refused to go in cleanly, and every movement felt sluggish in my soaked clothes. But I pushed through, knowing that the more I got done, the less I'd have to deal with in the morning. It wasn't until I went to grab more supplies from the truck that I realized something was off. The clearing felt different. I couldn't explain it at first, just a strange sensation that crept up my spine. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. I stood still, rain dripping from the brim of my hat, listening. The forest was alive with the sounds of the storm. Branches creaking, water rushing through the underbrush, the steady drumming of rain against the trees. But beneath all of that, I swore I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. A rustling, somewhere just beyond the tree-line. Slow, deliberate. Not the random movements of wind or rain, but something heavier, something careful. I squinted into the dark, my flashlight struggling against the rain. But all I saw was the wall of trees surrounding the clearing. I shook it off. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon nosing through the underbrush. This far out in the woods, it could have been anything. I went back to work, telling myself that I was being paranoid, that I was just tired, but the feeling never went away. The longer I stayed, the stronger it got. Every time I turned my back to the forest, I felt it, that same nagging sensation, like eyes pressed against me from the darkness. Every time I stopped to listen, the sounds of movement were gone. Just the storm, the wind, the trees shifting in the rain. By midnight, the unease had settled deep into my gut. I kept working, forcing myself to ignore it, but my hands were shaking, my breath uneven. I told myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion and the miserable weather were messing with my head. But no matter how much I tried to reason it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. And then I found the footprints. I almost didn't notice them at first, half washed away by the rain. But when I knelt down with my flashlight, my stomach dropped. They weren't mine. They weren't from my boots, and they sure as hell weren't from any animal. They were fresh, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the edge of the tree-line towards the cabin. Large, heavy steps, and the worst part, they stopped right at the edge of the flood lamp's reach. Whoever had made them had stood there, just out of sight, watching me. I shot up, scanning the woods with my light, but there was nothing there, just darkness and rain, the trees swaying under the weight of the storm. I was breathing too hard, my chest tight, my fingers clenched around the handle of my hammer. I wasn't alone. Someone had been out there. Someone had been standing just beyond the light, watching me. I should have left right then and there. I should have thrown my tools in the truck and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. I told myself it was old tracks, that they'd been made earlier in the day by one of the other workers, that no one was out there now, that it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I forced myself to keep working, but I was faster now, more frantic. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked like something moving in the dark. The rain was getting heavier, hammering against the half-built walls, drowning out everything else. And then the power cut out. The flood lamp went dark, plunging the entire site into blackness. I froze. The generator. It had been running fine all night. No signs of struggle, no flickering lights. It hadn't sputtered or slowed. It had just stopped. I turned, my flashlight cutting weakly through the rain. The generator was near my truck, a few yards away from the cabin. I could barely see it, just a dark shape in the downpour. I didn't want to go out there. Everything in me was screaming to get in my truck and leave. But my tools were still scattered, half my supplies left out in the open. If I left everything behind, I'd have to explain it in the morning. I'd have to admit that I ran, that I got scared. So I forced myself to move, step by step through the mud towards the generator. My flashlight flickered. The rain pounded against my hood, drowning out everything else. I reached the generator. The fuel line had been cut. Not torn, not damaged by weather. Cut. A clean slice like someone had taken a knife to it. My stomach twisted, and then I heard it. A sound just behind me. Too close, too real. I spun, my flashlight catching movement just beyond the edge of the trees. A shape, a figure, tall, unmoving, just standing there, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait. I ran. Straight to my truck, slipping in the mud, my hands scrambling for the door handle. I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks shut. My fingers fumbled with the keys, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The engine roared to life. Headlights flooded the clearing, and there was nothing there. The trees stood still. The rain fell heavy. The footprints were gone. I didn't stay to look for more. I hit the gas, tires spinning in the mud, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. I never went back. The next day, my boss called, furious about the mess I left behind. But I didn't care. Quit. Whatever was out there, whoever had been watching me, I wasn't going to stick around to find out what they wanted. And I sure as hell wasn't going back into those woods again. That's it. That's my story. It's been years, but I still think about that night. The footprints, the figure in the trees, the feeling of being watched. Some things you just don't go back for. I never should have gone back to that cabin. If I had known what was waiting for me, I would have turned around the moment I saw the first sign of trouble. But sometimes you don't get that choice. Sometimes the road leads you straight into something dark, and once you're in, there's no getting out. It started when I got a call from an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. His name was Mark. We used to work together on a logging crew deep in the forests of Montana back in the early 2000s. Hard work, long days, good pay. But over time, life pulled us in different directions. I moved to Idaho, settled into a quiet life doing contracting jobs, and Mark joined the police force. I hadn't heard from him in over a decade. When he called, his voice was off, flat, almost emotionless. He asked if I could come up to a cabin he owned, just outside of Missoula, not far from where we used to work. He told me he needed help fixing up the place, said it was in rough shape after sitting empty for years. I hesitated. Something about the way he spoke made my stomach tighten. But he was an old friend. I owed him that much. So, I packed up my truck with tools, extra clothes, and enough food to last a week, then started the long drive up north. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from any real town, the kind of place you wouldn't stumble across by accident. The road leading there was barely a road at all, just a strip of dirt winding through thick trees. I arrived just as the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the forest. Mark's truck was already there, parked in front of the cabin. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking in the sight of the place. The cabin was old, a one-story structure with a sagging roof and walls darkened from years of exposure. The windows were intact, but the front porch looked like it might collapse if I stepped on it wrong. I expected Mark to come out and greet me, but the place was silent. No movement inside, no sound of footsteps. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the handle, it turned easily. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, glancing around. A small kitchen to the left, a single bedroom down a short hallway, and a living area with a stone fireplace straight ahead. Something felt wrong. There was no sign of Mark. No bags, no personal belongings, just a few old pieces of furniture covered in dust. Then I noticed it, a dark stain on the wooden floor near the fireplace. Dried, almost black. Blood. My stomach twisted. I turned toward the bedroom, heart pounding. The door was slightly open. I pushed it the rest of the way and saw the bed, unmade, sheets crumpled and dark with more of that same dried stain. I stepped back. My hands were shaking. Then I heard it. Car engine not far off. Someone was coming. I moved quickly, slipping back outside just as the vehicle came into view. Police cruiser. Mark's truck was still there. Why would another cop be coming? The car rolled to a stop and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's uniform. He wasn't Mark. He looked at me, then at the cabin. His face didn't change, but I could see something in his eyes. Calculation. He knew. Help you with something? I asked, keeping my voice even. He didn't answer right away, just looked past me, toward the open cabin door. You here alone? He finally asked. I nodded. Was supposed to meet an old friend. He's not here. His eyes flicked to Mark's truck. I could almost see the gears turning in his head. You mind stepping over here for a second? He said, motioning toward his cruiser. Everything in my body told me not to move. I kept my hands at my sides, steady. Why? He took a slow step toward me. Because I asked you to. And then I saw it. On the ground near the steps of the cabin, half hidden in the dirt. A boot print. Fresh. Not mine. Someone else had been here, or was still here. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted for the trees. I heard the cop yell something, then the sharp crack of a gunshot. Bark exploded near my shoulder as I ran. Another shot, closer. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs aching as I pushed deeper into the forest. The sun was almost gone now, the woods turning dark around me. I could still hear the cop behind me, crashing through the underbrush. He wasn't calling for backup. He wasn't trying to arrest me. He was hunting me. I ducked behind a thick tree, chest heaving. My mind raced. If he found me, I was dead. That much was clear. Mark was dead. I knew it now. That stain in the cabin, the missing belongings, the way this cop had shown up without question. Mark had either found something he shouldn't have, or he'd been part of something he couldn't escape. Either way, they'd made sure he disappeared. And now they were going to do the same to me. I stayed low, creeping further into the woods. My truck was out of reach. The only road out was controlled by them. I had one chance. I moved carefully, staying out of sight. The forest was thick, the underbrush helping to muffle my movements. I needed to find a way to circle back, to get to the main road. Hours passed. The night stretched on, cold and silent. I heard voices at one point, more men searching, flashlights cutting through the trees. I didn't let them find me. By dawn, I made it to a highway miles from where I started. I looked like hell, covered in dirt, scraped up, exhausted. A passing trucker pulled over when I waved him down. I didn't tell him the full story, just that I'd been lost in the woods after my truck broke down. He gave me a ride to the nearest town. From there, I kept moving. I never went back to Montana, never called anyone about Mark. I knew how this worked. They were cops. They could make evidence disappear, twist a story, turn things against me. If I tried to go to the police, I wouldn't make it out alive. So I disappeared. I changed my name, moved to another state, started fresh. But I never forgot, and I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I had been stationed at a temporary outpost for about 2 weeks when the trouble started. It was a remote cabin, barely more than a shack, set deep in the woods of Montana. The department had set it up as a forward operating post for search and rescue efforts and law enforcement in the region. Too many missing persons cases had been piling up. Hikers, hunters, and campers who had ventured too far from civilization and never made it back. The idea was to have a unit stationed out here so we could respond quickly instead of waiting for officers from the nearest town, which was almost 2 hours away. It was just me and another officer, Ray Mitchell. We rotated shifts, one of us patrolling while the other stayed back at the cabin. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure with a desk, a couple of cots, a small kitchen area, and a radio unit for communication. No internet, no cell service. The only connection to the outside world was the radio and a landline that only worked when it felt like it. The first week was quiet. Too quiet. Just routine checks, occasional reports of lost hikers who always turned up before we even had to mobilize. But something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, the kind that pressed in on you at night. No distant traffic sounds. No airplanes overhead. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under something's weight. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just adjusting to the isolation. But then things started happening. It began with the noises outside the cabin at night. At first, it was subtle footsteps crunching through the dry leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. I figured it was wildlife. Bears were common in the area, and so were mountain lions. But the noises didn't match. They were slow, deliberate, not the kind of movement you'd expect from an animal just passing through. Felt like someone was out there watching. One night, as I was lying on the cot, half asleep, I heard it again. But this time, the footsteps stopped just outside the cabin door. I reached for my gun, heart pounding, and sat up, listening. The door had no window, just solid wood, but there was a small side window. I moved to it, slowly, carefully, and peered out. Nothing. I waited, barely breathing. After a few moments, the footsteps started again, this time moving toward the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The wind was picking up, rustling the trees, but other than that, nothing moved. Then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the tree line straight to the cabin door. They were human, barefoot. The ground was cold that time of year, nearly freezing at night. No one should have been walking around barefoot. I followed them a few feet before they disappeared into the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing but the wind. The next morning, I told Ray. He shrugged it off, said it was probably some local messing with us. People don't like cops out here, he reminded me. Maybe some hiker playing a joke, but it didn't stop. A few nights later, I was on patrol while Ray stayed back at the cabin. The roads were empty, nothing but dark woods pressing in from both sides. About an hour into my drive, I got a call over the radio. "Get back here now." Ray's voice came through, low and urgent. I asked what was going on, but he didn't answer, just repeated himself, "Get back here now." I turned the car around and floored it. By the time I got back, the cabin was dark. No lights. The front door was open. I drew my gun and stepped inside. The place was trashed. The desk was overturned, papers scattered. The radio unit was smashed to pieces, but no sign of Ray. I checked the perimeter. No footprints, no signs of a struggle outside. The landline was dead, of course. My patrol car's radio still worked, so I called it in. Backup was on the way, but it would be at least an hour before anyone arrived. I searched the cabin again, slower this time. That's when I noticed something. The cot where Ray had been sleeping was soaked in blood. I followed the trail, small drops leading out the back door and into the woods. I didn't want to go in there, but I had no choice. The trail went deep, I kept my gun up, my flashlight scanning between the trees. The air was cold, my breath visible in the beam of light. After about 15 minutes, I saw something up ahead, a shape on the ground. It was Ray. He was still alive, barely. His face was pale and he was clutching his stomach. There was a deep wound across his abdomen, like he'd been cut with something sharp. I tried to lift him, but he let out a pained breath and shook his head. He grabbed my wrist, squeezing weakly, and pointed past me, back toward the cabin. I turned. There was someone standing between the trees. I couldn't see their face, just a dark shape, motionless. Watching, I raised my gun, but before I could do anything, the figure took a step back and disappeared into the woods. I carried Ray back, dragging him most of the way. It felt like hours before the backup finally arrived. They got him out of there, rushed him to a hospital. He made it barely, but he wouldn't talk about what happened. Not to me, not to anyone. The department shut down the cabin a week later. The official story was that it was a bear attack, but I knew better. I don't know who was out there. Maybe some lunatic living in the woods. Maybe someone who didn't want us poking around. I don't go back out that way anymore. Whatever was in those woods, I never want to see it again. I didn't want to take the job, but work was slow, and I needed the money. The offer came from an old coworker, Jake, who had moved up north a few years back. He said his uncle needed someone to watch over his cabin while he was out of town for the season. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place, make sure no squatters or animals moved in, and occasionally chop firewood for when he returned. It was easy money, and I figured I could use the time to clear my head. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from anything resembling civilization. The nearest town, if you could even call it that, was Deadwood, a small, dying place with one gas station, a diner, and not much else. Jake told me it used to be a logging town back in the day, but now it was just a forgotten dot on the map. I drove up there in early October, the air getting colder the farther north I went. The road leading to the cabin was rough, just a long stretch of dirt and gravel cutting through miles of forest. It had rained the night before, and my truck skidded in the mud more than once. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly what I expected. Old, weathered, and isolated. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, their branches thick and tangled like they had been trying to reclaim the land. The roof sagged slightly in places, the wood on the porch was warped, and the windows were smudged with years of dirt. There was an old, rusted axe embedded in a stump near the front door, and a stack of firewood leaned against the side of the cabin. I let myself in, the door creaking on its hinges. The inside was musty, smelling of damp wood and dust. A stone fireplace sat in the corner, cold and lifeless, and a small kitchen with an ancient-looking stove took up one side of the room. There was a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress and a small bathroom with an old, yellowed sink. I dropped my bag on the couch and set to work. I checked all the windows and doors, made sure the place was sealed up tight, then went outside to bring in some firewood. The sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up some canned soup, and sat on the porch, listening to the forest. It was quiet out there, too quiet. No traffic, no distant hum of a city, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the hoot of an owl. It was the kind of silence that made you feel small, like the whole world had forgotten about you. But as the days passed, that silence started to feel wrong. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I would wake up in the middle of the night and realize that even the insects had stopped making noise. No wind, no movement, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. Then the strange things started happening. One morning, I found the front door unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I always did. I chalked it up to me being careless, locked it again, and went about my day. The next night, I heard something moving outside. It wasn't an animal, at least it didn't sound like one. It was slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps crunching in the dirt just beyond the tree line. I grabbed the old hunting rifle that had been left in the cabin and stepped outside. But by the time I did, the noise had stopped. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud near the porch. Human footprints. They led from the trees to the cabin, stopped at the front door, then turned around and went back into the woods. I told myself it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe a hunter, maybe some local looking to scare off a trespasser. But deep down, I knew it was neither. There was something wrong about those tracks. Something off. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. My heart stopped. I had locked it, I knew I had. I lay still, barely breathing, listening to the silence. Then I heard it, soft, slow footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Someone was inside. I reached for the rifle beside the bed, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. I could hear breathing low, controlled. Then the doorknob rattled. I sat up, aiming the rifle at the door. My finger hovered over the trigger. The knob twisted, but the door didn't open. It was locked. A long pause. Then, without a sound, the footsteps moved away. The front door creaked open again. Then silence. I stayed up until dawn, gripping that rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. When the first light of morning spilled through the window, I finally found the courage to check outside. The footprints were back, but this time they didn't lead from the trees. They led from underneath the cabin. My stomach turned. The cabin had a crawl space beneath it, just a few feet of empty space between the floor and the cold earth. I had never thought to check it. I didn't want to, but I had to know. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped off the porch, and crouched down near the edge of the cabin. The opening to the crawl space was just a dark void, a gaping mouth in the dirt. I aimed the light inside. At first, I didn't see anything, just dead leaves, tangled roots, and the wooden beams supporting the cabin. But then, in the farthest corner, something moved. A hand, pale, thin fingers retreating into the darkness. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to run, to get the hell out of there, but I forced myself to think. If I ran now, whoever was under there could slip out and follow me. I needed to end this. I grabbed the axe from the stump, my pulse pounding in my ears. I moved back to the crawl space and waited, gripping the handle so tight my hands went numb. Then, ever so slowly, a face emerged from the darkness. It wasn't just pale. It was sickly, gaunt, with sunken eyes and lips so dry they were cracked. It was a man, but barely. He looked starved, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and empty. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lunged. I swung the axe without thinking, the blade sinking deep into his shoulder. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp but didn't stop. His fingers clawed at my legs, his mouth opening in a silent snarl. I yanked the axe free and swung again, and again. Then he stopped moving. I don't remember much after that. I was running, my truck roaring to life, the trees blurring past as I sped down that dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached town, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I called Jake, told him everything. He didn't believe me, not at first. But when he sent someone to check the cabin, they found the body. The police said he must have been living under there for weeks, maybe months. A drifter, a runaway, someone who had been surviving on scraps and rainwater. but they couldn't explain the footprints leading from the trees. They couldn't explain how the door kept unlocking itself. I never went back to that cabin. Never wanted to. I still dream about it, though. The footsteps, the breathing, the way he looked at me, like he had been waiting for me. I never planned on stopping. I was driving through the back roads of northern Montana, trying to make it to a small town before nightfall. The road was long and empty, a narrow strip of asphalt cutting through thick forests on both sides. I had been driving for hours, and the only sign of life I had seen was the occasional deer darting across the road. My gas gauge was creeping toward empty, and I knew I had to find a place to stop soon. I checked my phone. No signal, no GPS. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and the sun was already starting to dip behind the tree line. Then I saw it. A small dirt road leading off the main highway, barely noticeable among the thick underbrush. A battered wooden sign stood at the entrance, the paint long faded, but I could still make out the words, "Private property, no trespassing." I should have kept driving, but something about the road called to me. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe I was just tired of sitting behind the wheel. Either way, I turned down that dirt path, my tires kicking up dust as I went deeper into the woods. The road was rough, full of potholes and jagged rocks. Branches scraped against the sides of my truck as I moved forward, winding deeper into the trees. I figured there had to be a cabin at the end, maybe an old hunting lodge or a forgotten homestead. Somewhere I could rest for a while, maybe even find an old gas can. After what felt like an eternity, the trees finally opened up into a small clearing. And there it was, a cabin. It was old, long abandoned, with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. There were no signs of recent activity, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of rotting wood and wet leaves. The place was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I told myself I'd only be here for a few minutes. The front steps creaked under my weight as I approached. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open wider, revealing the dark interior. The inside was even worse than I expected. Dust covered every surface, thick cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air smelled of decay. A broken wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by old chairs, some of them missing legs. The floor was littered with debris, fallen plaster, dead leaves, and old, unidentifiable stains. I stepped inside, my boots making soft thuds on the wooden floor. The air was heavy, like the place was holding its breath. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling away to reveal the bare wood underneath. In the far corner of the room was an old stone fireplace, the bricks blackened with soot. Above it, a rusted hunting rifle hung on the wall, the wood rotting away. To my left was a narrow hallway leading to the back of the cabin. My instincts told me to leave, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the table, among the dust and debris, was a plate, a white ceramic plate with a fork resting on top. It wasn't covered in dust. It hadn't been sitting there for years like everything else. Someone had been here, recently. My mouth went dry. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a hunter passing through? Maybe a squatter? I looked around again. The dust was disturbed in places, as if someone had been walking through the cabin. I turned back toward the door, suddenly feeling very exposed. Then, from deep inside the cabin, I heard it. A soft creak. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something inside the cabin had moved. Every instinct told me to leave. I should have turned around, walked out the door, and never looked back. But I didn't. I stepped toward the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. The floor groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the cabin. There were 3 doors in the hall, one on the left, one on the right, and one at the end. The one at the end was slightly open. The sound had come from there. I moved slowly, barely breathing. My hands were sweating, and my legs felt stiff, like I had forgotten how to move properly. I reached the door and pushed it open with the tip of my boot. The room was dark. The only light came from a broken window, casting long shadows across the floor. And in the center of the room, something was wrong. The floorboards had been pulled up, revealing a dark hole beneath the cabin. A square opening, big enough for a person to fit through. The wood around it was splintered and torn, as if someone had clawed at it. I took a step back, my breath quickening. Then I noticed something else. The floor around the hole was wet, not with water, with blood. A dark, sticky puddle seeped into the wood, trailing toward the opening. It wasn't old. It hadn't dried yet. My entire body went cold. I turned and ran. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, through the front door. My boots hit the dirt, and I sprinted toward my truck, my keys already in my hand. But just as I reached for the door handle, I heard it, a low, shuffling sound. From inside the cabin, I spun around. The front door was still open, revealing the dark interior. Then, slowly, something stepped out. I couldn't see its face. It was tall, thin, covered in ragged clothes. Its arms hung at its sides, unnaturally long. It moved slowly, deliberately, its head tilting slightly as it stared at me. I didn't wait. I threw myself into the truck, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. Panic flooded my veins. I twisted the key again. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the porch, watching. Then it took another step forward. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, my breathing ragged. The truck finally roared to life. The figure was closer now. I jammed the gear into reverse, my tires spinning in the dirt. The truck lurched backward, barely missing a tree. I twisted the wheel, shifting into drive. The last thing I saw before I sped away was that figure, standing motionless in the clearing, watching me go. I didn't stop driving. Not until I reached a gas station an hour away. I stumbled inside, still shaking, my clothes soaked in sweat. The attendant gave me a strange look but didn't ask any questions. I wanted to tell someone, the police maybe, but what would I say? That I found an abandoned cabin in the woods, and something was living beneath it? That I saw something that wasn't quite human? I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that cabin, about the blood on the floor, about the thing that crawled out from beneath it. And I wonder how many others have taken that same dirt road, looking for a place to rest, and never left. I had no reason to say yes when my old friend Matt asked if I wanted to stay at his uncle's cabin for a while. I wasn't the type to take random trips, and I had too much going on in my life to waste time out in the woods. But something about the way he asked made me hesitate. He wasn't trying to sell it to me. He wasn't talking about fresh air, open space, or the quiet of nature. He just said, "It's a good place to be alone. Maybe that's what I needed." So I told my boss I'd be taking a week off work, packed some clothes and gear into my truck, and hit the road. The cabin was in a remote part of Montana, miles away from the nearest town. I followed Matt's directions, which took me down a long, unpaved road that wound through thick, dark pines. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun had started dipping behind the trees, throwing long shadows over the grass. It was smaller than I expected, old too. The wood had gone gray from years of rain and sun, and the roof sagged in places. A rusted-out pickup sat to the side, half buried in weeds. The front door had a thick metal latch, and the windows were covered with wooden shutters. It looked abandoned. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like Matt said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. The floor creaked under my boots. There wasn't much inside, just a table, a couple of chairs, a fireplace, and a single bed with a thin mattress. Against one wall sat a rusty old stove with a pile of firewood stacked beside it. I spent the first hour sweeping the place out and airing it out as best I could. Then I set up my gear, unrolled my sleeping bag, lit a couple of lanterns, and got a fire going. It felt strange being out there alone, but I figured I'd get used to it. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the wind in the trees. There was no cell service, no internet, nothing but the quiet hum of the forest. It was peaceful in a way, but things changed the next day. I woke up early, made coffee on the stove, and decided to explore the area. Behind the cabin, the trees stretched for miles, thick and wild. I found an overgrown trail that led deeper into the woods and followed it for a while. About a mile in, I came across something strange. It was a clearing maybe 20 feet across with an old fire pit in the center. The rocks around the pit were blackened, and there were burned pieces of wood still inside. But what stood out the most were the bones. They were scattered around the fire pit, some half buried in the dirt. Some were small, animal bones probably, but others were bigger, too big. I didn't know much about bones, but something about them made me uneasy. They looked too thick, too long. I crouched down and picked one up. It was smooth, almost polished, and heavier than I expected. A bad feeling settled in my gut. I dropped it and stepped back. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping in the woods behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I started walking back to the cabin, faster than before. That night, I locked the door and latched the shutters. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just some old bones left behind by hunters. Nothing to worry about, but I kept thinking about that clearing, about the way the bones had been scattered, almost like I didn't finish the thought. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a sound outside. Slow, heavy footsteps on the porch. I sat up, heart hammering. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something big. I reached for my flashlight, hand shaking. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then the door handle turned. I shot out of bed, grabbed my knife from my pack. The handle rattled again, harder this time. I stood frozen, staring at the door. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I checked the porch.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting the isolation get to me. That night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, waiting. The footsteps came just after midnight. Slow, deliberate. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They moved around the cabin. I heard them circling the walls. I held my breath, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. Then, the sound of something scratching against the wood. Long, slow scratches running the length of the wall. I forced myself to stay still. Eventually, the sounds faded. Morning came and I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my things, loaded my truck, and turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, checked the battery, the fuel lines. Everything seemed fine. but the truck was dead. I was stranded. Panic started to set in. I had enough supplies to last a few days, but I didn't want to stay another night. I thought about walking to town, but it was too far. I spent the day trying to fix the truck. By the time the sun started setting, I knew I was out of options. I'd have to spend one more night. That night, the noises started earlier. Not just footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing right outside the window. I sat there in the dark, barely breathing myself. Then, a voice. Not a whisper, not a growl. Just one word, spoken softly through the wooden shutters. My name. I ran. I didn't stop. I ran through the trees, not caring where I was going. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw headlights. A truck parked on the side of a dirt road. A man inside, staring at me like I was crazy. I don't remember what I said, just that he let me in, that he drove me to town, that I never looked back. When I told Matt what happened, he went pale. He told me no one had used that cabin in years. Not since his uncle went missing. They never found him. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to. All I know is this. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some things aren't meant to be heard. I never went back. I had never been a fan of long drives, but the job required it. I was a contractor, the type that took on odd projects in places no one wanted to go. That's how I ended up deep in the forests of northern Montana, miles away from any town, repairing a remote hunting cabin for a man I had only spoken to over the phone. The pay was good, and the job seemed simple. Replace some old floorboards, fix the roof, and patch up any signs of wear. I left town just after sunrise, my truck loaded with tools and supplies. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, and finally just packed down earth. The farther I drove, the denser the trees became. The GPS had long stopped working, so I relied on printed directions scribbled down from the client's email. Took me nearly 6 hours to get there. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, old but sturdy, with a tin roof that had seen better days. The man who owned it wasn't there. That had been the arrangement. He'd mailed me the keys, said he'd check in when he could. I wasn't expecting visitors, which was exactly how I liked it. I parked my truck near the porch and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of pine and earth. I grabbed my tool bag and made my way inside. The cabin was small, just one main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom off to the side. Dust coated every surface, and the wooden floors creaked beneath my boots. The furniture was sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a sagging couch, and a bed in the other room. There were no personal items, no decorations. Just a place for someone to sleep when they needed to get away from the world. I set to work immediately, pulling up old floorboards and checking for rot. It was slow, tedious work, and by the time I glanced at my watch, it was past 9. The forest outside was black. The only sounds the distant calls of insects and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I locked up for the night, cooked a quick meal on the propane stove, and rolled out my sleeping bag on the couch. The bed in the other room looked too dusty to bother with. I woke up to a noise. First, I thought it was just the wind. Then I heard it again. Something moving outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, stopping and starting. My body tensed. I reached for the flashlight beside me and clicked it on, sweeping the beam toward the nearest window. Nothing. I sat up, listening hard. The forest was silent now. Too silent. The usual sounds of crickets and night creatures had gone still. Then another sound, a soft tap against the window. I turned the flashlight toward it, heart hammering. Again, nothing. Just the glass reflecting my own face back at me. I told myself it was probably a branch in the wind. That was logical, but something about the silence unsettled me. I got up, grabbed the hunting knife I always kept in my tool bag, and walked to the front door. I hesitated before opening it. Just a peek, I told myself. I pulled it open a crack and shined the flashlight out. The clearing looked just as it had before, empty. Then I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth just beyond my truck, and they weren't mine. I closed the door and locked it. For the next hour, I sat in the dark, knife in hand, listening. Nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke early, groggy but alert. The forest outside was back to its usual sounds. Birds, wind, the distant rustling of small animals. Whatever had been out there last night was gone. I went outside to check the footprints. They were still there, but there was something else now, drag marks. Something or someone had been dragged through the dirt away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. The marks were fresh, the earth still disturbed. I swallowed hard. I wasn't armed, apart from my knife. I had no cell signal. Driving back to town would take hours. I had two choices, pack up and leave or finish the job quickly. I chose the second. I worked faster that day, moving from one task to the next, keeping my focus sharp. But the feeling of being watched never left me. More than once, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Just a flicker, gone when I turned my head. The sun began setting too soon. By the time I put my tools away, the forest was bathed in deep orange light, shadows stretching long across the ground. I checked the footprints again. They were still there, but now there were more of them. Someone had been here again. I locked up early, keeping the knife within reach. I forced myself to eat, though I had no appetite. Then I sat in the dark, waiting. It didn't take long. The first sound was soft, a scrape along the cabin wall. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, someone circling the cabin. I held my breath, then a whisper, not words, just the sound of breath against the glass. I gripped the knife tighter. Whoever was out there, they weren't leaving. Then I heard the back door creak. I moved quickly, pressing myself against the wall, knife raised. The door was locked. It should have been locked, but I heard it opening. Slowly. I didn't wait. I lunged forward, slamming the door shut with all my strength, locking it again. Silence. Then laughter. Not loud, just a soft, rasping chuckle. I didn't sleep. I was done. I packed my tools as soon as the sun rose, tossing everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't bother looking for more footprints. I got in, started the engine, and peeled away from that cabin without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Days later, I got a call from the client. He wanted to know why I had left the job unfinished. I told him the truth, every detail. There was a long pause. Then he spoke. "I never sent you the keys," he said. "The cabin's been abandoned for years." I hung up, and I never went back. I moved into the cabin in the autumn of 2022. I had spent the last few years in the city, working a job that left me drained, living in a flat that felt like a prison, and dealing with the constant hum of traffic and people. I wanted silence. I wanted space. So, when I found an old cabin for sale on the edge of a thick woodland in Northumberland, I didn't think twice. It was small, but it had everything I needed. One bedroom, a wood-burning stove, and a plot of land that stretched into the trees. The first few months were peaceful. I spent my days chopping wood, fixing up the place, and hiking through the forest. There was a small town about 20 minutes away where I'd buy supplies, but other than that, I barely saw another soul. The woods were dense, stretching for miles in every direction, with towering trees that swallowed the daylight if you walked deep enough. I liked that, but as winter set in, things started to feel different. First, it was little things. Footsteps in the undergrowth at night when I knew no one lived nearby. A strange, sour smell in the air some mornings when I stepped outside. Small objects in my cabin moving from where I'd left them. A cup, a book, my boots by the door. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just getting used to being alone. Then I saw her. It was a cold, wet evening. Rain had been falling since midday, turning the dirt path outside into thick mud. I had spent the day stacking firewood and was inside making tea when I glanced out the window. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I stared into the trees, I saw her, a woman, standing completely still between the trunks, half hidden by the shadows. She was older, maybe in her 50s or 60s, with long dark hair hanging over her face. She was barefoot, wearing a thin, tattered dress that was soaked from the rain. Her arms hung limply by her sides, and she didn't move. She just stood there, staring directly at my cabin. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't go outside. I didn't move. I just stood at the window watching her. The rain blurred my view, and after a few minutes, I lost sight of her. I waited, heart pounding, but she didn't come closer. Eventually, I forced myself to turn away, to sit down and convince myself it was nothing. A lost hiker, maybe, someone from town. But I knew that wasn't true. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me tense. I kept picturing her standing in the woods, staring at the cabin, waiting. But when morning came, I told myself it was just a strange encounter and tried to push it from my mind, until I saw her again. A week later, just after sunset, I was outside chopping wood when I felt something, a shift in the air, that crawling sensation on the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. Slowly, I turned. She was there, closer this time. She stood at the edge of the trees, her body half hidden behind a thick trunk. Her wet dress clung to her thin frame, and I could see her more clearly now. Her skin was pale, her hair tangled, her hands bony and clenched into fists. Her lips were slightly parted, and I could hear her breathing. My hands tightened around the axe handle. I didn't move. I didn't speak. She didn't either. We stood there for what felt like forever, the only sound the wind moving through the trees. Then, without warning, she stepped backward, disappearing into the forest. I went inside and locked the door. That night, I kept the lights off and sat by the window waiting, watching. But she didn't come back. Not that night. The days passed in uneasy silence. I stopped going into the woods. I barely stepped outside after dark. I didn't know what she wanted or why she was there, but I knew, deep down, that she wasn't just some lost traveler. There was something else, something wrong. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up to a sound outside. Not footsteps, not the wind, a scratching sound, slow, deliberate, right outside my cabin wall. I held my breath, my body frozen. The sound moved along the wood, inching toward the window, and then silence. I turned my head, barely breathing, and saw her. She was at the window. Her face was right against the glass. Up close, she looked even worse. Her skin was mottled with dirt, her lips cracked and dry, her eyes dark and hollow. Her breath fogged up the glass, her fingers pressing against the window frame. I didn't move, couldn't. For what felt like an eternity, she just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, she tilted her head, her mouth twitching slightly. She was smiling. I don't remember how long I sat there, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. But at some point, She turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. That was the last straw. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care how much I had spent on the cabin, how much I had wanted this life. I wasn't staying. As I loaded my car, I felt it again, that heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched. I forced myself to look one last time. She was there, standing just inside the tree line, still watching. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, deeper in the woods, more figures stood, silent, motionless, watching. I got in my car and left. I never went back. Whatever was out there, whatever she was, I didn't want to know. I just drove. It was the middle of October, 1995. The air had a sharp chill to it, just cold enough that I could see my breath fog in front of me with each exhale. I had rented a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, deep in the woods and far from civilization. It was something I'd been planning for months, a quiet, isolated retreat where I could unwind from the stress of my day-to-day life. At the time, I was 32 years old, living in Charlotte, working as a freelance graphic designer. I spent most of my days staring at a computer screen, juggling clients who didn't know what they wanted and deadlines that always seemed to come too fast. I thought getting away for a week or two would help clear my mind. The cabin itself wasn't anything special. It had 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with an old wood stove, and a living room with a single, threadbare couch and a coffee table that looked like it had seen better days. The wood of the cabin was weathered, darkened by years of exposure to the elements, and the windows were slightly fogged over with age. It felt rustic, which was exactly what I was looking for. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and my thoughts. The nearest town was about a 45-minute drive down a winding gravel road, and the nearest neighbor was even further away. I had stocked up on supplies before arriving. Canned food, bottled water, and enough firewood to keep me warm for at least a week. The cabin had an old fireplace, and I planned to spend most of my evenings reading by the fire, maybe doing a little writing. I wasn't expecting much out of the trip, just peace and quiet. The first couple of days went by uneventfully. I spent my mornings hiking the trails around the cabin, taking in the sights and smells of the autumn woods. The trees were just beginning to shed their leaves, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of orange and brown. I'd always loved the way the forest felt in the fall, quiet, still, like the whole world was holding its breath. But by the 3rd day, something felt off. It started with small things I could easily dismiss if I wasn't paying close attention. The sound of twigs snapping in the woods late at night. The sensation of being watched when I was out walking. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to being alone in such an isolated place. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It was on the 4th night that things took a turn. I had spent the day hiking further into the woods than I normally would. There was a trail I had noticed that led up into the hills, and I figured it would give me a better view of the surrounding area. The hike was strenuous, and by the time I reached the top, the sun was already beginning to set. I stood there for a while, taking in the view, the rolling hills covered in dense forest, the way the sky seemed to glow orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. On my way back down, I got this strange feeling in my gut, like something was watching me. The woods had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, telling myself that it was just the approaching night that was making me anxious. When I finally reached the cabin, it was dark, and I was out of breath. I locked the door behind me and immediately set about building a fire. As the flames crackled and the warmth spread through the room, I began to relax a little, but that feeling of being watched still lingered. I sat on the couch, trying to read a book, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside seemed amplified. The wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no one out there. I was miles from anyone, and the only creatures around were deer, squirrels, maybe a few coyotes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but not quite. It was faint, almost like it was coming from far away, but unmistakable. I froze, my eyes darting toward the window. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across the room, but I couldn't see anything outside. I listened, straining my ears, but the sound didn't come again. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote passing through, but it didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't a bear, I was sure of that. I locked all the windows, even though I knew that if something wanted to get in, the thin glass panes wouldn't stop it. I double-checked the door, making sure the deadbolt was secure, then sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves. Hours passed, and I finally started to drift off, the book still open in my lap. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow in the room. That's when I heard the sound again, closer this time, right outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a growl this time. It was more of a scraping sound, like something dragging its claws across the wooden walls of the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, I sat up, my heart racing. The sound moved, circling the cabin. Whatever it was walking on two legs. I could hear its footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a fire poker, and stood up, creeping toward the window. The glass was fogged, but I could see something moving in the darkness outside, just beyond the tree line. It was tall, taller than any person, and its shape was wrong. It moved in a way that didn't seem natural, like it was trying to walk upright but wasn't used to it. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My mind was racing. What the hell was it? A bear? No, bears didn't walk like that. Maybe it was some kind of injured animal struggling to move. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the front door. I held my breath, gripping the fire poker so hard my knuckles turned white. The door creaked, the wood groaning under the weight of something heavy pressing against it. And then silence. I stood there, waiting, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't know. But eventually, the sound faded, and the woods returned to their eerie quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, gripping the poker, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I cautiously stepped outside, my eyes scanning the tree line. There were no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But the door had deep gouges in it, like something with claws had tried to tear its way inside. I thought about leaving, about packing up my things and driving back to town. But something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I stayed. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every night, I heard the footsteps outside the cabin. Every night, they got closer. I stopped hiking, stopped going outside altogether. I spent all my time inside, staring out the window, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. On the seventh night, I made a decision. I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to leave me alone. I packed my bags, threw them in the back of my car, and started the drive back to town. But as I drove down that gravel road, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. I glanced back, and for a split second, I saw it, standing in the middle of the road, watching me. It was tall, its limbs too long, its face twisted and wrong. Didn't move, didn't chase me. It just stood there, staring. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving until I reached the safety of the town. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know what I saw, and I don't want to know. All I know is that whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't an animal. It was something else. And it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. I had always been a hunter. Not for sport, not for trophies, but because I grew up in a family where hunting meant survival. I wasn't the type to spend weekends sitting in a tree stand, waiting for a buck just to mount its head on a wall. I hunted because I liked the silence of the woods, the patience it took, the way it made me feel in control of something that was otherwise unpredictable. It was a way of life for me, and I didn't think much about it when I decided to spend a week in a hunting cabin deep in the wilderness of Montana. I had used this cabin before years ago when I was younger. My uncle had built it as a place for the family to use whenever they needed to get away. It was small, just a single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a tiny kitchen area. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. I had been here a few times when I was younger, tagging along with my uncle on long hunts, but this was my first time coming alone. I left early in the morning, my truck packed with enough supplies to last me a week. Food, extra fuel for the lantern, a rifle, and a handgun for safety. The drive took hours, winding through back roads, gravel paths, and finally, the old dirt trail that led to the cabin. It had rained recently, and the ground was soft, my tires kicking up mud as I drove. When I reached the cabin, I parked a few yards away, taking a moment to step out and breathe in the crisp autumn air. The trees stretched high, golden leaves rustling in the light breeze. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed this deep in the woods. I unloaded my gear and carried it inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. Nothing had changed since I'd last been here. The cot was still in the corner, the stove covered in a thin layer of soot, the small wooden table against the wall. There was a rifle rack above the door, but it was empty. My uncle had likely taken his guns with him when he stopped coming. After unpacking, I took a short walk around the area to get a feel for the land again. I knew these woods well, but things could change over time. I checked the tree lines, noted fresh animal tracks near the creek, and scouted a good spot for hunting the next morning. The sun was already low by the time I returned to the cabin, so I started a fire in the stove, heated up some canned chili, and ate in silence. That first night, I slept lightly. The woods had a way of making every sound seem louder than it was. The wind against the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant hoot of an owl. It all blended into the background of the night. I kept my handgun close, just in case, but nothing happened. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I dressed in layers, grabbed my rifle, and set out toward the hunting spot I'd chosen the day before. I walked carefully, stepping over fallen branches and avoiding the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. I found a good vantage point near a clearing and settled in, waiting. Hours passed. A few deer wandered close, but they were young, not worth taking. I had enough food to last me a while, so I wasn't in a rush. It was around midday when I noticed something odd. Further in the distance, just beyond the clearing, there was a patch of disturbed earth. At first, I thought it might have been from an animal, a bear maybe digging for roots, but the more I looked at it, the stranger it seemed. The ground was uneven, like it had been deliberately dug up and then covered again. I made a note to check it out later and continued hunting. As the sun dipped lower, I finally spotted a buck, a good-sized one, standing still near the edge of the clearing. I steadied my rifle, lined up the shot, and fired. The crack of the gun echoed through the trees, and the buck dropped where it stood. I moved quickly, making my way to the animal. I was in the process of field dressing it when I heard something. Footsteps, Not an animal, something heavier. Human. I froze, my knife still in my hand. I listened. The sound was coming from the trees behind me. Slow, deliberate steps. I turned my head slightly, trying to see without making it obvious that I knew someone was there. Nothing. I waited, heart pounding. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed like that for a long time, just listening. Eventually, I finished with the buck, dragged it back toward the cabin, and kept my rifle in my hands the whole way. That night, I locked the cabin door. I didn't normally do that. Out here, there was no reason to, but something about those footsteps made my skin crawl. I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up, listening. The wind, the branches, the distant howls of coyotes. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard something different. Something outside. A slow, steady sound, like someone walking around the cabin. I sat up, gripping my gun. The sound circled the cabin once. Then silence. I waited. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might be loud enough for whoever was out there to hear. Then something tapped against the door. Just one tap. I didn't move. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a branch falling, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew that wasn't true. I stepped outside, rifle in hand, and looked around. There were tracks in the dirt.
Footprints.
They led from the trees to the cabin door, then back into the woods. Someone had been out there. I packed my things. I wasn't about to stay another night. I didn't bother hunting that morning. I loaded up my gear, hauled the deer into the truck, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The cabin got smaller and smaller until it was gone. I never came back. I didn't think much of the job when I first took it. It was simple work. Stay overnight at an old cabin near a small town graveyard and make sure no one trespassed. A guy I knew had told me about it. Said an old man owned the place but couldn't take care of it himself. It was easy money for someone willing to put up with the isolation. I was in my early 30s then, just trying to keep my head above water, and the pay was decent enough for what seemed like nothing more than sitting around. I was used to quiet, too. I had spent plenty of time alone before, so being out in the woods near a graveyard didn't bother me. At least that's what I told myself. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table. It sat at the edge of an old graveyard, the kind that had probably been there since the town was founded. The headstones were worn down, some of them just slabs of rock sticking out of the dirt. No new graves, just old ones, forgotten ones. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled through the trees, the wood in the stove crackled, and I sat in a rickety chair by the window, watching nothing happen. That's all I expected, nothing. But the second night was different. The wind had died down that night, leaving the air still and heavy. The silence was thick, pressing in on me in a way I didn't like. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every shift in the old wood. At some point, I stepped outside for some fresh air. The graveyard stretched out in front of me, pale headstones catching what little light the moon gave. That was when I noticed something. One of the graves looked different. It was subtle, but I was sure the dirt on one of them looked disturbed. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't settled like the others. Maybe an animal had dug at it. That was what I told myself. I didn't want to think about the other possibilities. I went back inside, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me. I kept looking out the window, back at that same grave. Something about it made me feel watched. Hours passed. I tried to shake the feeling, but every time I looked out the window, my eyes went straight to that same grave. Then, around midnight, I saw something move. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The graveyard was still, but I could swear I saw something shift in the dark. A shape small, low to the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside again, scanning the area. Nothing. The grave looked the same. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze. I was imagining things. That had to be it. Still, I didn't like it. I double-checked the door before I locked it and sat back down, trying to push the unease away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had moved, and that it wasn't done moving. Sometime later, as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint but distinct, soft, deliberate. Not the sound of an animal. Too slow, too steady. They crunched over the dead leaves just outside the cabin. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached for the flashlight but didn't turn it on. The footsteps circled the cabin. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I held my breath, listening. They stopped just outside the window. I waited. Seconds dragged by. Then, slowly, they moved again, this time toward the door. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone when I stepped outside earlier. No signs of another person. No reason for anyone to be out here. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a faint knock came from the door. Not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. I didn't move. Then came another, and another. I had no intention of opening that door. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the footsteps moved again, this time away from the cabin, back toward the graveyard. I didn't sleep that night. Morning came slow. As soon as the sun was up, I stepped outside. The air was cold, the ground damp with morning dew. I walked to the graveyard, my gut already telling me what I'd find. The disturbed grave from the night before? The dirt was even more unsettled now, like something or someone had been digging at it. There were no footprints, at least none I could see clearly. Just the dirt, shifted in a way that set every nerve in my body on edge. I thought about calling the old man who owned the cabin, but what would I even say? That I heard footsteps and found some messed up dirt? He'd probably tell me it was nothing. I decided I'd give it one more night. If anything happened again, I'd leave. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the walls of the cabin. I told myself that was good. It would drown out any sounds I didn't want to hear, but it didn't. Just past midnight, the footsteps came back. Slow, steady. They circled the cabin. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then came the knocking, same as before, like controlled. I gripped my flashlight, my hands sweating. The knocking stopped. Then something else. A sound I hadn't heard before. Faint scraping. Not at the door. Not at the walls. Somewhere farther out. I knew where. I forced myself to stand, heart pounding. I reached for the window, just enough to see outside. The grave. Something was there, crouched over it. Person. Their back was to me, their hands in the dirt, digging. I froze. They weren't using a shovel, just their hands. The dirt piled up beside them, their movements quick, desperate. I wanted to look away. I wanted to close the curtain and pretend I hadn't seen anything. Then they stopped. Slowly, their head turned. They didn't get up. They didn't move closer. They just stared. The wind howled outside, shaking the trees. I didn't blink. I barely breathed. Then, without warning, the figure bolted. Not toward the cabin. Toward the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, I made my decision. I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the pay. I drove straight to town, found the old man, and told him I wasn't doing it anymore. He didn't ask why. He just nodded. I didn't ask him anything either. I didn't want to know. A week later, I heard they found another grave disturbed out there. Different one this time. I didn't go back, and I never will. It was late September when my brother called me out of the blue. I hadn't heard from him in nearly a year. He wasn't the type to stay in touch. He was always in and out of trouble, drifting from town to town, finding work where he could, getting into fights, and, as I later found out, getting involved in things he shouldn't have. I answered the call, and before I could even say anything, he told me he needed help. His voice was low, rushed. He gave me an address, somewhere deep in the woods, far from any main roads. He said I needed to come alone and to bring some food and supplies. Then he hung up. I hesitated for a while. I didn't know him anything. I had my own life, a steady job, a small apartment, and enough problems of my own. But there was something in his voice that I couldn't shake. Something urgent, desperate. Against my better judgment, I packed a bag with some canned food, water, and a flashlight. I also threw in an old hunting knife, more out of habit than anything. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I had grown up with my brother. Trouble followed him wherever he went. I drove for hours. The further I got from the city, the darker it became. Trees lined both sides of the road, thick and towering, blocking out most of the sky. The GPS lost signal an hour before I arrived. I had to rely on an old printed map, tracing my finger over the winding dirt roads leading to the cabin. The place was exactly what I expected. Isolated, run down, surrounded by nothing but woods. The cabin itself was small, with a sagging roof and wooden walls that looked like they hadn't been maintained in years. A single light flickered inside. I parked my truck a little way off, not wanting to pull up right in front. I walked up cautiously, stepping over tree roots and patches of dead leaves. The door was slightly open, creaking as the wind moved it back and forth. Inside, my brother was sitting on an old wooden chair, his face thin and tired. He had lost weight. His eyes darted around, restless. He looked older than he should have, like he had seen things that aged him beyond his years. The room smelled like sweat, old food, and something else, something metallic. Blood. I looked down. There was a stain on the wooden floor, dark and smeared. My stomach tightened. "What the hell have you done?" I wanted to ask, but I stayed quiet. He stood up slowly, wincing as he did. That's when I noticed the bandage wrapped around his side. Blood had already soaked through the fabric. He had been hurt badly. I placed the bag of supplies on the table and took a deep breath. "Who's looking for you?" I finally asked. His eyes met mine for a split second before shifting to the window. There was someone else out there. I turned my head slowly, listening. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches rustling. Other than that, silence. No birds, no crickets, no distant hum of traffic. He moved toward the back of the cabin, his steps uneven, and motioned for me to follow. There was another room, smaller, barely furnished. Against the wall, near the floor, was a locked wooden chest. "Help me move it," he muttered. I hesitated before grabbing one side, lifting it with him. Beneath it was a hatch, a trapdoor leading to a crawl space. "I need you to stay quiet," he whispered, "no matter what." Then he climbed down into the darkness, dragging himself below. I followed, feeling the cool air rush up from the space beneath the cabin. It smelled of damp earth and old wood. I pulled the hatch shut just as I heard the sound of an engine rumbling in the distance, tires rolling over dirt, the sound of multiple doors opening, heavy boots crunching against the ground. My brother pressed a finger to his lips, eyes wide. Then came the voices. Men, at least 3 or 4 of them. They weren't lost. They weren't hikers. They were looking for something, someone. "His truck's here," one of them said. A long pause, then another voice, rougher. "Then he's close." I held my breath. Heavy footsteps creaked against the wooden floor above us. Someone stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under their weight. I heard a drawer open, the sound of objects being tossed aside. They were searching. Another voice. Bleeding out somewhere. Check outside. Footsteps again, moving back toward the door. I heard them walk around the cabin, boots crunching against gravel and twigs. I turned to my brother. His breathing was slow, controlled, but I could see the pain in his face. He was losing blood, fast. We stayed in that crawl space for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. Then, a sudden noise. A loud crash, something being knocked over. A voice cursed. Silence followed. Then the sound of an engine revving. Tires skidding against dirt. They were leaving. We stayed in the crawl space even after the sound of the truck faded into the distance. I finally pushed open the hatch and climbed out, helping my brother up. His legs were weak and he leaned against the wall. "They'll come back," I said. He nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. I didn't ask what he had done. I didn't ask who they were. It didn't matter. I helped him out of the cabin, guiding him to my truck. We didn't speak as we drove. I took him to an old friend's place, someone who owed me a favor, someone who wouldn't ask questions. I never saw that cabin again. I never asked my brother what had really happened there, and I never answered his calls after that night. I hadn't been down that road in years. Not since the divorce. Not since I packed up the last of my things, threw them in the back of my truck, and swore I'd never look back. But life doesn't always care about what you want. I was on a long drive that night, trying to make it back to my place before sunrise. The highway had been shut down due to a wreck, and my GPS told me the only way around it was through the back roads. Roads I had once known like the back of my hand, but had spent years avoiding. It was raining, of course. That kind of steady, miserable rain that clings to the windshield and turns the world into a mess of blurry lights and shadows. The wipers scraped back and forth, barely keeping up. The trees on either side of the road were tall and thick, leaning inward like they wanted to block out the sky entirely. And then I saw it, the turnoff, a cracked, narrow road that led deep into the woods, winding up toward a place I never wanted to see again, my ex-wife's cabin. For a split second, I thought about turning around, about finding another way no matter how long it took. But there was no other way. The detour was forcing me right past the place I'd promised myself I'd forget. So I kept driving. The road was worse than I remembered. Potholes everywhere, the kind that could snap an axle if you hit them too hard. The trees were even thicker here, the headlights barely cutting through the dark. I told myself I wouldn't look. I told myself I'd keep my eyes straight ahead, just get past it, and pretend it wasn't even there. But when I rounded the bend, I couldn't help it. The cabin stood just beyond the trees, exactly where I remembered it. The old wooden porch, the stone chimney, the way the second-story window faced the road like a watchful eye. The whole place looked abandoned. The grass had grown tall around it, wild and unkempt. The fence out front was broken in places, sagging under the weight of time and neglect. And then I saw the light, a dim glow coming from one of the windows. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, heart pounding. There shouldn't be anyone there. My ex had left the place long before I did. She had moved across the country. No one had lived there in years, but someone was inside. I slowed the truck without thinking, tires crunching against the gravel shoulder. Rain tapped against the roof, the only sound besides the idling engine. I knew I shouldn't stop. I should have kept driving, left whatever was happening back there to someone else. But there was this nagging feeling in my gut, the same one I used to get when I lived there. Something wasn't right. I killed the engine. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the cabin through the rain. The glow in the window flickered slightly, like it was coming from a candle or a flashlight instead of a proper lamp. A shadow passed by, someone moving inside, I got out of the truck, rain soaking through my jacket instantly. The air was cold, the kind that sinks into your bones. I stepped carefully, avoiding the deeper puddles in the dirt driveway. The front porch creaked under my weight. The door was unlocked. That was the second bad sign. I pushed it open slowly, the old hinges groaning in protest. The inside smelled of dust, damp wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic. I stepped inside. The living room was the same as I remembered. The old fireplace against the far wall, the couch that had once been covered in blankets, the wooden beams that stretched across the ceiling. But it all looked different now, darker. I moved toward the glow. It was coming from the kitchen. I reached the doorway and stopped. A candle sat in the middle of the old wooden table, its flame barely flickering in the still air. Papers were scattered around it, yellowed pages, notebooks, things that looked like they'd been left behind for years. And then I saw the footprints, wet, muddy prints leading from the back door, across the floor, stopping just before the table. I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned slowly, scanning the darkness. My breathing felt too loud. The rain outside had softened, leaving the cabin filled with nothing but silence. And then a floorboard creaked upstairs. I froze. The second floor, the bedroom, my ex-wife's old room. I reached for my pocket, fingers wrapping around my pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I stepped forward instead. The stairs groaned under my weight. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness. The bedroom door was cracked open, just slightly. Another creak. Someone or something was in there. I pushed the door open. The bed was covered in dust, the mattress sagging. The closet door hung open, empty. The only thing in the room was a chair, sitting in the middle of the floor. And on the chair was a single folded piece of paper. I hesitated before picking it up. The paper was old, crinkled, but the words written on it were fresh. "Why did you come back?" My blood went cold. I spun around, heart hammering. The room was empty. The whole cabin was empty. But I didn't feel alone. Something was watching me. I didn't wait any longer. I bolted down the stairs, nearly slipping on the last step. I hit the front door so hard it slammed against the wall. The truck was still there, headlights reflecting off the wet road. I jumped inside and locked the doors, my breath coming in short gasps. The cabin sat there in the darkness, silent, waiting. I backed up, tires spinning in the mud. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The road was even worse on the way down, potholes jarring the truck. But I didn't slow down. Only when I was miles away did I finally breathe again. I don't know who was in that cabin. I don't know who left that note. But I knew one thing. I was never coming back. It was late autumn when I finally started building the small cabin. I had been putting it off for months, waiting for the right time, but life kept getting in the way. Work, family, bad weather, there was always an excuse. By the time I actually got around to it, the days were already getting shorter, the nights colder. I had chosen a spot deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a little plot of land I had bought a few years back. A clearing surrounded by thick trees, far enough from the main road that I wouldn't hear traffic, but not so deep that I'd get lost. I wanted a place to escape to, a small, quiet cabin where I could go to clear my head, maybe even spend weekends away from everything. That night, the rain started just as I was getting the last of my materials unloaded from the truck. A steady drizzle at first, then heavier, until the sound of raindrops tapping against the tarp covering my supplies drowned out everything else. I should have left. I should have packed everything back up and driven home, But I didn't. I told myself I had already wasted enough time. The foundation was already set from a previous trip, simple concrete blocks forming a small square. The frame was halfway up, the skeleton of what would be a simple one-room structure. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, a door, a window. A place to sleep, to sit by a small wood stove, maybe read a book. I worked by lantern light, hammering nails into the wooden planks, securing the walls against the wind. My gloves were soaked through. My jacket clung to me, cold and heavy. Every movement felt sluggish, my muscles aching from the effort. But I kept going. The rain made everything harder. The wood was slick. My tools kept slipping from my fingers, and every time I looked up, water streamed down my face. But the worst part was the darkness. There's something about being alone in the woods at night, with nothing but a lantern casting shadows around you, that makes you feel vulnerable. The trees seemed taller, the sounds sharper. The rain masked everything. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Anything that might be moving beyond the glow of the lantern. I ignored it. I told myself it was just my imagination. The wind, an animal, maybe even my own footsteps echoing off the trees. But then I heard it. Not the wind, not an animal, something else. A thump, not close but not far either. Somewhere past the trees, beyond the clearing. A deep, solid sound, like something heavy hitting wood. I stopped hammering, holding my breath, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the rain, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then another thump, closer. I turned, lantern held high, scanning the edge of the clearing. Nothing. The trees stood still, unmoving, dark shapes against the night sky. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe, telling myself again that I was imagining things. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe the rain had loosened something. Maybe an animal had knocked over a pile of wood I had left nearby. I didn't want to check, but I did. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, clicking it on as I stepped away from the half-built cabin. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet ground, the scattered tools, the piles of lumber. I walked slowly, every step deliberate, my boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. Then I saw it. Piece of wood. One of the beams I had stacked earlier, now lying a few feet away from the pile. It hadn't rolled. It hadn't slipped. It had been moved. I shined the flashlight over the area, searching for footprints, signs of movement, anything. But the rain had already washed away any trace of what had happened. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. For a long moment, I stood there, breathing hard, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. I wanted to run back to my truck, to leave everything behind and drive home. But I didn't. I told myself there was no one out there. I forced myself to turn back to the cabin, to keep working, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But my hands shook. I worked faster, nailing the last of the boards into place, checking my watch every few minutes, counting the hours until sunrise. The rain didn't stop. The wind picked up. The lantern flickered. And all the while I felt it. Presence. Something just beyond the trees, watching. By the time I finished securing the roof, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. The sky was still black, no sign of dawn yet. My clothes were soaked through, my fingers numb, my body exhausted. But I couldn't rest. I had to check again. I grabbed the flashlight and walked back to where I had found the fallen beam. It was still there, half buried in the mud. But something was different. More beams were scattered now. Pieces of wood I had stacked carefully were lying several feet away, as if they had been kicked, thrown. And then I saw it. Footprint. Deep in the mud, half washed away by the rain. Not mine. Bigger. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. I wasn't alone. I turned back to the cabin, moving quickly now, gathering my things, throwing tools into the truck. I didn't care about finishing the job. I didn't care about the supplies I left behind. I just wanted to get out. I climbed into the truck, slamming the door, locking it. My hands shook as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. Headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the narrow dirt road ahead. I didn't waste any time. I pressed my foot on the gas, speeding down the trail, not caring about the bumps, the potholes, the branches scraping against the sides of the truck. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. By the time I got home, the rain had stopped. My clothes had dried. My body ached, but I couldn't sleep. I never went back to that cabin. I left it half-finished, forgotten. Let the rain take it, let the woods reclaim it. It wasn't mine anymore. Whoever had been out there that night, whoever had been watching, waiting, I wasn't going to give them another chance. I sold the land a few months later, never told the buyer what happened, and I never went back. I took the trip because I needed some time away. Life had been pressing down on me from every direction. Work, responsibilities, the dull routine that never seemed to let up. I figured a quiet weekend in a remote cabin with just my dog, Cooper, would be the perfect way to clear my head. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine. He had bought the property years ago but barely used it. It sat deep in the woods, far from any main roads, tucked between tall pines and dense undergrowth. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room structure with a small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a cot pushed against one wall. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. That was fine with me. The drive took longer than expected. I had left later than I planned, and by the time I reached the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I rolled down the window and took a deep breath of the cool, earthy air. The forest smelled damp from recent rain, and the only sounds were the hum of my truck's engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze moved through the trees. Cooper, my German shepherd, sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked up and eyes scanning the trees. He was always alert, always on edge in unfamiliar places. I reached over and scratched behind his ears. "We'll be fine, buddy." The cabin came into view after another few minutes of careful driving. It looked the same as I remembered. Aged wooden planks, a slanted tin roof, and a small porch with a single rocking chair. I parked the truck near the front and stepped out, stretching my legs. The woods were already growing dark, the last bit of daylight barely cutting through the thick trees. I grabbed my duffel bag and Cooper's food, then unlocked the door. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. I flicked on my flashlight and took a quick look around. Everything was as it should be. The cot was still against the wall, the wood-burning stove stood in the corner, and a small pile of firewood sat next to it. I set my bag down and let Cooper explore while I got settled. I poured him a bowl of food and grabbed a couple of logs to get a fire going. The temperature had dropped significantly since sundown, and I didn't want to be freezing all night. By the time the fire was crackling, the cabin had taken on a cozy warmth. I sat on the cot, eating a protein bar, while Cooper lay on the floor beside me, occasionally lifting his head at the slightest noise outside. That's when I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dead leaves. I froze, my chewing stopping mid-bite. I held my breath, listening. Cooper lifted his head, ears twitching. He had heard it too. I waited. Silence. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging around. The woods were full of them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stood up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. Cooper was already on his feet, his body tense. I moved to the window and shined the beam outside. Nothing but trees and darkness. I took a step back, letting out a slow breath. It was fine. I was overthinking. I double-checked the door's lock, then settled back on the cot. Cooper, however, didn't lie back down. He sat by the door, staring at it, watching. Sleep didn't come easy. I drifted in and out, waking up every hour to the sound of the wind or a tree branch cracking in the distance. Each time I checked, Cooper was in the same spot, listening. Then, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching. Not the wind, not an animal. Something was scratching against the cabin's wooden walls. Slow, deliberate. My blood ran cold. I reached for my flashlight with shaky hands and pointed it toward the door. Cooper was standing now, body rigid, a low growl vibrating in his throat. The scratching continued. It wasn't frantic or random like an animal. It was methodical, slow drags of something against the wood. I grabbed my knife from my bag and stood up. My pulse hammered in my ears. I moved toward the window, careful to keep the light low. When I peered outside, my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, still, unmoving, watching. The light from my flashlight barely reached that far, but I could make out the shape of a person. No details, just the silhouette. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night? I turned off the flashlight, my heart pounding. My thoughts went to my truck. It was parked outside, but the keys were in my bag. If I made a move for it, would they rush me? Cooper let out a sharp bark, and the scratching stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving away from the cabin, fading into the woods. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. An hour. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I sat up, my muscles stiff. Cooper was still by the door, but he looked calmer now. I grabbed my knife and cautiously opened the door. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone being there. Just the scratches on the wood. Long, deep marks trailing along the side of the cabin. I didn't stick around. I packed my bag, grabbed Cooper, and got into the truck. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that place. I never told my friend what happened, but I never went back to that cabin again. I took the night shift at the cabin because I needed the money. It wasn't my cabin, I wasn't that lucky. It belonged to a guy named Jack, a friend of my uncle's, who needed someone to watch the place for a few nights while he was out of town. Jack owned a stretch of land in northern New Mexico, out past the last few houses, past the paved roads, past the areas where cell service worked. His cabin was a small wooden thing with a porch, a metal roof that rattled in the wind, and a generator out back for electricity. There was no plumbing, just an outhouse, and water had to be hauled in. It wasn't luxury, but he swore it was peaceful. He had a couple of sheds, a rusted pickup that didn't run, and some supplies stocked up. Mostly food in cans, water jugs, and some tools. He told me to keep an eye on the place because people had been poking around lately. Probably just some folks passing through, he'd said before leaving. Maybe kids messing around. Just keep an eye out. I figured it was easy money. Stay in the cabin, make sure no one stole anything, maybe read a book, sleep a little. The first night was quiet. The second night wasn't. I was sitting on the porch around 9 p.m., drinking from a bottle of water, when I heard something in the trees. The land was covered in pinyon and juniper trees, small, twisted things with thick branches. You could see through them in the daylight, but at night, they just turned into a dark mass. The noise came from inside that mass. At first, I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something smaller, but the sound wasn't right. It wasn't movement. It was something tapping, a slow, steady sound. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my flashlight on and pointed it toward the trees. The beam wasn't strong enough to see far, but I caught glimpses of branches, shadows shifting in the wind. Nothing unusual. The tapping stopped. I waited for a while, listening. The wind blew, the trees creaked, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I went back inside. I locked the door and checked the windows. Jack had a rifle in the cabin, just an old bolt-action .22, but I made sure it was loaded. Not that I expected to use it, but it made me feel better. I stayed up for another hour, reading an old magazine I found in a drawer. Then I went to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The room was dark. The wind was still going. Everything seemed normal, but something felt wrong. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the porch. I stayed completely still. It was a light tapping, like someone tapping their fingers against wood. Steady, slow, right outside the door. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I listened. Tap, tap, tap. Then it stopped. I waited, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. The silence stretched on. The wind howled outside. Then there was a new sound. The doorknob rattled. Not hard, not like someone trying to break in, just testing it. My chest tightened. I sat up slowly, keeping the flashlight off. The rifle was against the wall. I reached for it, careful not to make any noise. The doorknob rattled again. Then silence. I gripped the rifle and listened. I didn't hear footsteps. No movement. Just the wind. Minutes passed. Then something scraped against the wood outside. Not on the door. The wall. I stood up, my heart hammering. The cabin had a single window facing the porch. I moved toward it carefully, not stepping too hard. I reached out, touched the curtain, and pulled it back a little. Nothing. The porch was empty. I let out a slow breath, then shut the curtain again. I stood there for a long time, rifle in hand, waiting to hear something else. But there was nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I stepped onto the porch and looked around. There were no footprints, but the ground was hard, mostly dry dirt and rocks. If someone had been out here, they didn't leave a sign. I walked to the edge of the trees, looking for anything at all, but it was just normal land. I thought about leaving, but I'd promised Jack I'd stay. I'd only had one more night left. I stayed up late that evening, keeping the porch light on. The wind had died down. The night felt too still. Around midnight, it started again.
Top,
Tap.
top.
It wasn't on the porch this time. It was on the back of the cabin. I sat frozen in the chair, staring toward the back window. The tapping moved. It circled the cabin. Slow, steady. Then something stepped onto the porch. I heard the boards creak. I gripped the rifle. I stood up, moving toward the window. I reached for the curtain, hesitated, then pulled it back. A man stood on the porch. He was facing the door, standing perfectly still. He wasn't anyone I recognized. His clothes were dark, old-looking. His face was pale in the porch light. He didn't move. I raised the rifle, but he didn't react. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the window. I yanked the curtain closed and backed away. My pulse pounded in my ears. The porch creaked. I aimed the rifle at the door. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I don't know. When I finally looked again, he was gone. I waited for dawn. The second the sun rose, I packed my stuff and left. I didn't care about the money anymore. I never saw Jack again. I never went back to that cabin. And I never figured out who that man was. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the woods. There was something about being completely surrounded by nature that made me feel at ease. The sound of the wind moving through the trees, the scent of damp earth, the crunch of leaves underfoot. It all felt right. That's why, when I took a week off from work in late September, I decided to drive out to a remote part of the state where I had heard about some good hiking trails. I wanted to spend a few days away from everything, just me and the wilderness. I didn't have a strict plan. I packed a tent, enough food for a few nights, and my rifle just in case I needed it for protection. I figured I would find a good spot near one of the streams, set up camp, and enjoy the quiet for a while. The drive was long, taking me deeper into the woods than I had ever been before. The roads were mostly dirt and gravel, winding through dense forest with no signs of human presence for miles. Eventually, I reached the area I had mapped out, parked my truck off the side of the road, and started my hike into the trees. The plan was simple: find a clearing, set up my tent, and enjoy the peace. But things didn't go as planned. After about an hour of hiking, I stumbled onto something unexpected. Hidden behind a thick layer of overgrowth, I saw the outline of a building, a cabin. It was old, abandoned, and barely visible through the trees. The wooden walls were gray and weathered, the roof sagging in places. Vines had crept up the sides, wrapping around the structure like nature was trying to reclaim it. I don't know why, but I felt the urge to check it out. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the appeal of shelter over a flimsy tent. Either way, I pushed through the brush and approached the front porch. The steps groaned under my weight, the wood soft and damp from years of exposure. The door was slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I hesitated. There was an uneasy feeling in my gut, like I had just stumbled into something I shouldn't have. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old cabin, probably built by hunters or loggers decades ago and left to rot. I stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust floated in the dim light that streamed through the broken windows. The floor was littered with dead leaves, dirt, and bits of collapsed ceiling. Against one wall stood an old wooden table with a few rusted tools scattered on top. A fireplace sat on the opposite end of the room, filled with ash long since turned cold. Something about the place felt off. Not haunted, not supernatural, just wrong, like it had been left in a hurry. I noticed a chair lying on its side near the fireplace, as if someone had knocked it over. A torn jacket hung on a rusted nail by the door, stiff with age. There were no personal belongings, no dishes, no food wrappers, nothing that suggested someone had lived there recently. Just emptiness. I should have left right then. But instead, I convinced myself to stay the night. The place was solid, better than my tent. And despite the eerie feeling, it was shelter. I swept away the worst of the debris, laid out my sleeping bag near the fireplace, and got a fire going. The warmth did little to make the place feel welcoming, but at least I wasn't sleeping in the cold. That first night was when things started feeling wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason. The fire had burned down to embers, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind outside had picked up, making the trees groan and sway. And then I heard it, a sound, faint, almost lost in the wind. A rustling outside, like footsteps in the underbrush. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, reaching for my rifle. I held my breath, listening. Silence. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, but I wasn't convinced. I lay back down, gripping the rifle tight. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the uneasy feeling still lingered, but I pushed it aside. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the trip. I spent the day exploring the area, checking out the nearby stream and looking for signs of any recent human activity. There was nothing. The second night was worse. I woke up again, this time to a different sound. A soft creaking, like weight shifting on the old wooden porch. My pulse pounded in my ears. I held my breath, gripping my rifle as I listened. Another creak. Someone or something was out there. I slowly sat up, moving as quietly as I could. The fire had nearly died again, casting only faint light. The door was still closed, but I could see the outline of it against the darkness outside. Then, the doorknob rattled. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Something was trying to get in. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence. And then, after what felt like an eternity, footsteps, moving away, slow, unhurried, like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake. I sat there until morning, not daring to close my eyes. When the sun finally came up, I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The dirt in front of the steps had been disturbed. Footprints, barefoot, human. I was done. I packed up immediately, shoving everything back into my bag without bothering to organize it. I needed to get back to my truck, back to civilization. But the woods felt different now. As I hiked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. When I finally reached my truck, I felt relief like I'd never known. I threw my bag into the back, climbed in, and started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life was the best thing I had ever heard. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back at the tree line one last time, and that's when I saw him, a man, standing between the trees, tall, thin, barefoot, watching me. I didn't stop, didn't take a second look. I just drove. I don't know what I walked into that night. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I will never go back to that place. I had never been the kind of guy who liked the deep woods. Sure, I had gone camping a few times, mostly as a kid when my father would take me and my brother out to a nearby lake to fish. But that was different. Those were controlled trips, where we had the safety of our truck, a cooler full of supplies, and the reassurance that home was never too far away. This trip, however, was something else entirely. It was late September, and I had taken some time off work to clear my head. Things hadn't been going well for me. My girlfriend had broken things off a few months back. I was struggling to keep up with the bills, and the stress of it all was starting to get to me. A friend of mine, Paul, had a family cabin deep in the woods near a place called Dead River Bend, about 3 hours north of where I lived. He had offered it to me for a weekend, saying it would do me some good to get away from the noise of the city. Figured, why not? A few days alone, no distractions, no phone buzzing every few minutes, just some fresh air and quiet. I left early Friday morning, my old truck packed with enough food and supplies to last me the whole weekend. The drive out was uneventful, just miles of empty highway and long stretches of thick forest lining both sides of the road. It wasn't until I turned off the main road and onto the dirt trail leading to the cabin that things started to feel different. The further I drove, the narrower the trail became. Tall trees closed in on both sides, their branches arching overhead like twisted fingers. The sky, which had been bright and open on the highway, was now barely visible through the thick canopy. The air felt heavier too, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of every single sound. I finally reached the cabin just past noon. It was a small, one-story structure, built out of dark wood with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. A creek ran a little ways behind it, and beyond that, the forest stretched for miles. It was isolated, completely cut off from anything or anyone. I parked the truck, grabbed my bag, and made my way inside. The place was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it was cozy enough. After unloading my gear and cracking open a beer, I stepped outside to take in the surroundings. The woods felt different now that I was standing in them, quieter, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. There was an old path behind the cabin that led down to the creek. The water was shallow but ran fast over smooth stones, cutting through the landscape like a silver vein. It was peaceful in a way, but something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the trees leaned over the water, their tangled roots reaching out like grasping hands. Or maybe it was just the knowledge that I was completely alone out here. By evening, the temperature had dropped, and I decided to start a fire inside. I made myself some dinner, just canned soup and some bread, and sat by the fireplace, listening to the crackling wood. It should have been relaxing, but that uneasy feeling never really left me. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to complete silence. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was cold. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a single sharp sound outside, a footstep. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer passing through, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The sound had been deliberate, heavy, like a boot on dirt. I reached for the flashlight on the table, clicked it on, and slowly stood up. The cabin had one window facing the front porch, and I moved toward it, careful not to make any noise. The flashlight's beam cut through the glass, illuminating the porch and the stretch of ground beyond it. Nothing. I waited, standing completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. A minute passed, then another. The forest remained motionless. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just jumpy from being alone out here. I turned away from the window and took a step back toward the couch. Then the sound came again, louder this time, right outside the door. A slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the wood. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. I grabbed the rifle Paul had left in the cabin. I wasn't a gun guy, but in that moment I was grateful for it. I checked to make sure it was loaded and stepped closer to the door, listening. The dragging stopped. Silence. Then, just as I started to relax, something slammed against the door. I jumped back, my pulse spiking. It was hard, forceful, like someone testing it. I raised the rifle, aimed it at the door, and forced myself to take a breath. The smart thing to do was to wait. Whoever or whatever was out there would see that I wasn't coming out and move on. Another slam. The door shook in its frame. I tightened my grip on the gun. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stood there, rifle raised, waiting. Minutes stretched on. The only sound was my own breathing. And then, without warning, the doorknob turned. Slowly. I didn't think, I just reacted. I raised the rifle and fired through the door. The shot echoed through the cabin, deafening in the silence. The wood splintered, and the doorknob jerked violently. Then nothing. I stood there, my body rigid, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Minutes passed. I finally forced myself to move. I crept to the window, flashlight in hand, and shined it out onto the porch. Nothing. No body. No sign of anyone. But the doorframe was scratched. Deep, jagged marks carved into the wood. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, gun in my lap, listening. But whoever or whatever had been outside never came back. At first light, I packed my things, threw everything into the truck, and left without looking back. I never told Paul what had happened. Never told anyone, really, but I never went back to that cabin. And I never will. I inherited my uncle's old farm cabin after he passed away in 2018. It wasn't a massive estate or anything, just a simple wooden structure on a few acres of land in western Montana. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick patch of trees, maybe half a mile from an open field where cattle used to graze. My uncle, Richard, had lived there alone for the last 20 years of his life, after selling off most of the farmland that had been in our family for generations. He wasn't much of a social man, so I never spent much time with him growing up. When I got the call about his passing, I was surprised to hear that I was the one inheriting his cabin. I wasn't particularly close to him, but I figured it was his way of keeping the place in the family. I arrived in late October, just before the temperature started to drop for the winter. The drive out was long and mostly silent, just the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional chirp of the GPS. The closest town was nearly 20 miles away, and the last 10 miles of the trip were spent on an old dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. My tires kicked up dust as I passed through a tunnel of pine trees, the sky barely visible through the thick canopy overhead. When I pulled up to the cabin, I wasn't sure what I expected. It was smaller than I remembered, a single-story structure with a slanted tin roof and a covered porch. The wood was faded and cracked in places, the paint on the window frames peeling away. A rusted metal windmill stood to the side of the property, creaking as a weak breeze turned its blades. The place had an eerie stillness to it, like it had been frozen in time since my uncle's passing. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I walked up the steps to the porch, the old boards creaking beneath my boots. The front door was locked, but I had the key. It took a little effort to get it to turn, the lock stiff from years of neglect. When I finally got the door open, a stale, musty smell wafted out to greet me. The inside was just as I had imagined. Dust-covered furniture, shelves lined with old books, a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning, airing out the place, and unpacking the few belongings I had brought. My plan was to stay for a few weeks, maybe longer if I could fix the place up a bit. I wasn't planning on living there permanently, but I figured I owed it to my uncle to at least take care of what he had left behind. That first night, I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the sky darken as the sun dipped behind the trees. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt peaceful in a way, like the world had shrunk down to just me and the cabin. But that feeling didn't last. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside. It wasn't a loud noise, just a faint rustling, like someone or something was moving through the tall grass near the treeline. I sat up, listening. The sound continued for a few moments, then stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal. The woods were full of them, deer, raccoons, maybe even a coyote. I tried to go back to sleep, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. The next day, I explored the property. The land had once been a working farm, but now it was mostly overgrown. I found an old barn a few hundred yards from the cabin, its roof partially caved in. The doors hung open, revealing the skeletal remains of wooden stalls inside. Rusted farm equipment sat abandoned in the tall grass, half buried by years of dirt and neglect. I walked the perimeter of the property, checking the old fence line. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the woods, where the trees started to thicken, I found a series of deep, uneven footprints in the dirt. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. They led from the treeline toward the cabin, then back into the trees. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my uncle had wandered out here before he passed. Maybe the land had visitors I didn't know about. But something about those footprints unsettled me. They were too large to be from a deer, and the pattern was strange, like whoever had left them had been moving cautiously, pausing between steps. That night, I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. but I still couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was louder this time, slow, deliberate footsteps in the grass, coming from the direction of the barn. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, but the moonlight streaming through the window cast long shadows across the floor. I listened, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they started again, closer this time. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on. The weak beam of light illuminated the dust-covered walls, the wooden dresser, the closed bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Silence. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to get out of bed. I crept to the window, flashlight in hand, and peeked outside. The yard was empty. The windmill still creaked in the breeze. The barn stood in the distance, its broken roof casting jagged shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe the wind had stirred the grass just right. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a single boot print pressed deep into the dirt just outside the front door. It wasn't mine. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the locks, checking every window, making sure nothing was out of place. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up with the shotgun my uncle had left behind, sitting in a chair by the front door. The hours dragged by, the cabin creaking and settling around me. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of the doorknob turning. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My grip tightened around the shotgun as I held my breath. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. I waited, heart pounding, but whoever or whatever had been outside didn't try again. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and left. I didn't care what my uncle had left me, didn't care about fixing up the cabin. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I never went back. I put the cabin up for sale a few months later. It sat on the market for over a year before someone finally bought it. I didn't ask who. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I was never setting foot on that land again.